Tonight, we're examining Ormund Hightower, the Green's Ruthless Mastermind. This is a topic with a lot to uncover, but I'll keep my narration calm so you can still drift off to sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. In Oldtown, power did not need to shout. It stood beside the whispering sound in stone, in ships, in storehouses, in the high tower rising above the city, and in the long memory of a family older than the Iron Throne itself. When the Dance of the Dragons divided Westeros, Ormund Hightower ruled this immense inheritance, and when he chose Aegon II and the Green cause, he did not simply offer another lord's banner. He placed one of the realm's richest cities, strongest houses, and deepest reserves of influence behind a single claimant. That was the true weight of Ormund Hightower. The dragons drew the eye, as dragons always do. Their wings darkened battlefields. Their fire decided arguments that had lasted for generations, and their riders became the faces of the war. But dragons required food, roads, castles, sailors, smiths, ravens, loyal men, and above all, someone capable of turning wealth into action. Ormund belonged to that quieter world of power. His strength was not merely the blade at his hip, or the men who answered his summons. It was the machinery behind them. House Hightower had Oldtown. Oldtown had trade flowing through its harbour, learning gathered around the citadel, faith rooted in the starry sept, and influence reaching far beyond the reach. A lord who controlled such a place could shape events without ever needing to sit near the Iron Throne. Ormund understood that influence could be stored, protected, and spent with care. In a civil war, that made him especially dangerous. He carried Vigilance, the Valyrian steel sword of House Hightower. Like so many ancient blades, Vigilance was more than a weapon. It was a visible reminder that the Hightowers had endured through ages of conquest, alliance, and change. Valyrian steel was rare. A sword such as Vigilance suggested a house accustomed to standing among kings, even when it did not wear a crown itself. Ormund was tied closely to the family network that had helped place the Greens at the center of the struggle. He was the nephew of Otto Hightower, the formidable hand of the king, and cousin to Queen Alicent. These connections mattered, but they did not make Ormund a passive extension of other people's ambitions. As Lord of Oldtown, he possessed his own authority, his own household, and his own reasons to make certain that Hightower influence survived whatever shape the realm took afterward. He was also a father, with sons who represented the next generation of the house, and a daughter whose future would be part of the same careful dynastic arithmetic. His first wife died in childbirth, and he later married Samantha, binding Oldtown more closely to another notable Reach family. Even the household around him reflected the political character of the age. Daeron Targaryen, a prince of the Green Line, was taken into Hightower care after the death of his father. In a world where fosterage could create loyalties as strong as blood, that was no small thing. Descriptions of Ormund paint the image of a highly educated lord, a man drawn to histories, tapestries, and the accumulated lessons of the past. Yet scholarship did not soften him. If anything, it gave him a colder sense of what power demanded. He could appear measured and dutiful in public, while preserving plans that others had not yet seen. He was not defined by grand speeches or sudden displays of temper, though he was certainly capable of viciousness. His more enduring quality was patience. That patience would matter as the war spread through the Reach. With a major Hightower host at his command, Ormund became one of the Green's essential southern pillars. His army represented a vast concentration of manpower at a moment when every lord had to decide whether his soldiers would guard their own lands, march for a dragon king, or wait carefully to see who remained standing. The roads toward Honeywine and the troubles surrounding Tumbleton would place his decisions under greater strain. There, the difference between open submission and genuine surrender could become very important indeed. Ormund Hightower was a lord who understood that a war was not won only by charging forward. Sometimes, it was won by keeping a city fed, an army intact, a family united, and an enemy uncertain of what you intended to do next. Oldtown was not built for spectacle. Its power was not the kind that announced itself with trumpets or banners flapping in a conqueror's wind. It was the kind of power that had stood for thousands of years before the Targaryens crossed the narrow sea, and it would stand for thousands more after they were gone. The Hightowers understood this. They had always understood it. And when Ormund Hightower became the lord of that city, he inherited not just a title, but a system of influence so deeply embedded in the fabric of Westeros that it could sustain a war almost by itself. Consider what Oldtown actually was. It was the oldest city in the Seven Kingdoms, a place where the faith of the Seven had its most sacred seat in the Starry Sept, where the citadel trained every maester who served every lord from the Wall to the Summer Sea. Its harbour was one of the busiest in the known world, connecting the Reach to the markets of Lys, Myr, Tyrosh, and beyond. Its streets were lined with counting houses, guild halls, and the manses of merchant families whose wealth rivaled that of many lords. And its army, when called, could draw on the manpower of one of the most densely populated regions in Westeros. Ormund did not need to ride a dragon to matter. He needed only to give an order, and the entire apparatus of Oldtown would shift to serve his will. That is the central question that hangs over Ormund Hightower's role in the Dance of the Dragons. How much power can one city place in one man's hands? Because Oldtown was not merely a source of gold or soldiers. It was a nexus of legitimacy. The faith could crown a king or deny one. The citadel could shape the information that reached every castle in the realm. The merchant fleets could blockade a coast or supply an army. And Ormund, as lord of that city, controlled the point where all those forces converged. When he declared for Aegon II, he did not just add another name to a list of supporters. He gave the Green cause a foundation that no dragon alone could provide. Now, it is easy to think of the dance as a war of riders and flames. The images that linger are the ones of Vhagar descending on a battlefield, or Sunfire tearing through a rival, or the shadow of a dragon passing over a burning town. But wars are not won by fire alone. They are won by the ships that carry grain, the smiths who forge arrows, the ravens that carry orders, the gold that pays soldiers, and the lords who ensure that none of these things run out. Ormund Hightower was that kind of lord. He was the man who made sure the Green War Machine did not starve, did not run out of steel, did not lose its lines of communication. He was the infrastructure behind the throne, and he was not a man who wore that role lightly. Descriptions of Ormund from those who knew him paint a picture of a lord who was deeply educated, a scholar who surrounded himself with histories and tapestries and the accumulated wisdom of centuries. He could speak with maesters about the doom of Valyria, debate theology with septons, and discuss trade routes with merchants from the free cities. But that learning did not make him gentle. If anything, it gave him a colder, more precise understanding of what power required. He knew that a war could be lost not just by a bad battle, but by a broken supply line, a delayed shipment, a lord who felt slighted and withdrew his support. He planned for those contingencies the way a maester plans for a plague, with quiet, methodical thoroughness. His weapon, Vigilance, was a fitting symbol for the man. Valyrian steel swords are rare, and each one carries the weight of the house that wields it. But Vigilance was not a sword of conquest. It was a sword of endurance, a blade that had been passed down through generations of Hightowers who had watched kingdoms rise and fall from the safety of their tower. It suggested a house that did not need to prove itself through aggression, because its position was already secure. Ormund carried that sword, but he did not need to draw it often. His power was not in the blade, but in the knowledge that it was there, a reminder that House Hightower had survived every challenge the centuries had thrown at it. His family connections only deepened that sense of embedded influence. He was the nephew of Otto Hightower, the hand of the king, who had spent decades maneuvering the Greens into position. He was the cousin of Queen Alicent, the woman whose children would sit the Iron Throne if the Green cause succeeded. And he was the foster father of Prince Ryder, who had been placed in Hightower care after his father's death. In a world where fosterage created bonds as strong as blood, that wardship was a political asset of enormous value. Daeron would grow up surrounded by Hightower loyalty, Hightower values, Hightower expectations. When the time came, he would fight for the Greens not just because of his mother, but because of the family that had raised him. Ormund's own household reflected the same careful dynastic arithmetic. His first wife had died in childbirth, a tragedy that left him with young children and the need for a new alliance. He married Samantha Tarly, binding Oldtown to one of the most martial houses of the Reach. His sons, Lionel, Martin, and Garmund, would carry the Hightower name into the next generation. His daughter Bethany would be married to secure another alliance. Every marriage, every wardship, every fosterage was a thread in a web that Ormund had spent his life weaving. And when the war came, that web would hold. But the war did not come to Oldtown directly, at least not at first. The Reach was a vast region, and the fighting there would unfold in campaigns that stretched across rivers, forests, and castles. Ormund's role was to mobilize the Hightower host, to gather the men and supplies that would make the Green Army in the south a force to be reckoned with. His army, numbering somewhere around 15,000 men at its peak, was one of the largest standing forces left in the realm. It was not a rabble of hastily summoned peasants. It was a professional force, equipped and supplied by the wealth of Oldtown, led by knights who had trained in the yards of the High Tower, and commanded by a lord who understood that war was a matter of logistics as much as courage. That army would march into the heart of the Reach, toward the Honeywine, toward Tumbleton, toward battles that would test not just Ormund's military skill, but his ability to keep his forces intact when the war turned against the Greens. And it would turn against them. The dance was not a clean war. It was a war of betrayals, of shifting loyalties, of lords who changed sides when the wind shifted. Ormund understood this. He had spent his life studying the patterns of history, and he knew that survival often required flexibility. There are accounts that describe him as a lord who could appear to submit when necessary, who could present a compliant face to an enemy while quietly preparing a countermove. That quality, the ability to seem defeated while still planning victory, would become essential as the war ground on. Because the Greens needed more than dragons. They needed someone who could hold the South together when the realm began to fracture. They needed a lord who could keep an army fed, a city loyal, a family united, and an enemy uncertain of what would happen next. Ormund Hightower was that lord. He was not the face of the war, not the rider of a dragon, not the king on a throne. He was the man behind the curtain, the one who ensured that the machinery of the Green cause did not break down. And in a war where so much depended on the unseen work of supply, planning, and patience, that made him one of the most dangerous men in Westeros. So when the Hightower host finally moved, when the banners of the High Tower unfurled above the columns of men marching toward the Honeywine, it was not just an army that marched. It was the weight of Oldtown, the wealth of its harbour, the learning of its citadel, the faith of its septs, and the long memory of a family that had outlasted empires. Ormund Hightower carried all of that with him, and he intended to use it. The war would test him in ways he could not yet foresee. But for now, he was the lord behind the Green Curtain, and the realm was about to learn what that truly meant. We spoke of Ormund Hightower as a man of cold patience and long planning, a lord who preferred to let others exhaust themselves while he waited. But to understand the patience, you must first understand the city that forged it. You cannot separate Ormund from Oldtown, and you cannot separate Oldtown from the High Tower itself. The High Tower is not merely a castle, it is a landmark, a lighthouse, and a statement of permanence. It rises from the island of Battle Isle, in the center of the Honeywine River, a massive structure of black stone and pale white marble that has stood for thousands of years. The base of the tower is made of fused black stone, a remnant of the mysterious builders who predated the first men. No one knows who raised that foundation. The Valyrians did not build it. The children of the forest did not build it. It simply exists, a relic from a forgotten age, and the Hightowers built their seat upon it. That alone tells you something about the family. They do not tear down the past. They build upon it, layer by layer, until they stand at the top of the world. To enter Oldtown is to enter a city that breathes history. The harbour is one of the busiest in all of Westeros, second only to the great ports of Braavos and perhaps King's Landing. But where King's Landing is a chaotic sprawl of mud and ambition, Oldtown is deliberate. The streets are paved, the canals are lined with stone, the warehouses along the Honeywine are organised by trade, each guild holding its own quarter. You can smell the salt from the sea, the spice from the ships, the incense from the septs. It is a city of merchants, scholars and priests, and they have learned to coexist because it profits them all. The trade routes of Oldtown stretch across the known world. Ships from the Summer Isles bring exotic fruits and feathers. Galleys from Lys and Myr carry silks and dyes. The great cogs of Braavos arrive with steel and glass. And from the Reach itself, the bounty of the most fertile land in Westeros flows down the Honeywine. Grain, wine, wool, and timber. The Hightowers take a cut of every transaction. They own the docks, they own the scales, they own the warehouses. They do not need to trade themselves. They simply control the ground upon which trade happens, and that is far more profitable. But Oldtown is not just a commercial centre. It is the spiritual heart of the Faith of the Seven. The Starry Sept, the original seat of the High Septon, before the Great Sept was built in King's Landing, still stands here. Its walls are made of black marble, its windows of coloured glass, and its ceilings are vaulted so high that the sound of prayer echoes like a distant storm. The faith may have moved its official centre to the capital, but the real power remains in Oldtown. The most devout Septons train here. The most ancient texts are kept here, and the Hightowers have always maintained a close relationship with the faith. They are not merely patrons, they are protectors. When the High Septon speaks, the Hightowers listen, and when the Hightowers need a word whispered into the ear of the faithful, the Septons oblige. Then there is the Citadel, the great stronghold of the Maesters, the order of scholars who advise lords and kings across the realm. The Citadel is a city within a city, a maze of towers, libraries and courtyards, where men spend decades studying ravens, medicine, history, and the higher mysteries. The Maesters are sworn to serve, but they are also sworn to knowledge, and knowledge, like trade, is a form of power. The Hightowers have always understood this. They fund the Citadel, they sit on its councils, they ensure that the brightest Maesters are sent to the most important castles. It is no accident that the Maesters of the Red Keep, the ones who whisper in the ears of kings, often have ties to Oldtown. To rule Oldtown is to control the flow of goods, the flow of faith, and the flow of information. That is a kind of power that does not rely on dragons or armies. It is slower, quieter, but far more durable. A dragon can be killed, an army can be scattered, but a city that has stood for 8,000 years, a city that is the center of commerce, religion, and learning, does not fall easily. The Hightowers do not need to conquer, they need only to endure, and they have endured. The Hightower family is one of the oldest in Westeros. They claim descent from the fickle High King of the First Men, and while that may be legend, their recorded history stretches back to the Dawn Age. They were kings in their own right before the coming of the Andals. They bent the knee to the Gardeners, the kings of the Reach, but they did so on their own terms. They kept their city, their tower, their wealth. When Aegon the Conqueror came, the Hightowers did not fight. They opened their gates, welcomed the Targaryens, and became one of the most trusted houses in the New Realm. That is the Hightower way. Adapt, survive, wait. The political machine of Oldtown is built on patience. Every lord of the Hightower knows that the Game of Thrones is played over decades, not days. You do not win by charging into battle. You win by placing your people in the right positions, by building alliances that last generations, by making yourself indispensable. Ormund Hightower is the product of that machine. He was raised in the shadow of the tower, educated in the citadel, trained in the counting houses and the guild halls. He knows how to read a ledger as well as a battle map. He knows how to negotiate a treaty as well as a trade agreement. And he knows that the most dangerous weapon is not a sword, but a promise. The city itself is a lesson in patience. Walk the streets of Oldtown, and you will see buildings that have been repaired and expanded for centuries. Nothing is torn down. Everything is built upon. The foundations are ancient, but the walls are new. The Hightowers understand that you do not need to start over. You just need to add another layer. That is how they have survived the rise and fall of dynasties, the coming of dragons, the wars of conquest. They are the bedrock, and everyone else is the tide. So when you think of Ormund Hightower, think of the city that raised him. Think of the tower that never falls. Think of the trade routes that never stop flowing. Think of the septs where prayers are offered for the Hightower name. Think of the maesters who write the histories that will remember him. He is not just a lord. He is the embodiment of a city that has learned to rule without a crown. And that brings us to the question of how such a city, such a family, chooses its side in a war. When the realm splits between Rhaenyra and Aegon, the Hightowers do not hesitate. They have been preparing for this moment for years. The alliances are already made. The gold is already counted. The swords are already sharpened. All that remains is to move. And Ormund Hightower, the lord of the ancient city, the master of the tower, the keeper of the trade routes, the patron of the faith, the friend of the citadel, is ready to lead his city into war. The harbour of Oldtown is not just a gateway for ships. It is a gateway for stories, for histories, for the slow accumulation of power that does not need to shout its name. And at the heart of that city, rising above the warehouses and the septs and the guild halls, stands the Hightower itself. But the house that bears its name, House Hightower, is not simply defined by the stone and fire of that beacon. Their power is older than the Targaryen dragons, older than the Andals, older even than the memory of the first men in many parts of Westeros. To understand Ormund Hightower, the man who would become the Green's most formidable military commander, you must first understand the foundation upon which he stood. And that foundation is not made of iron or steel. It is made of commerce, religion, knowledge, and marriage. The Reach is the breadbasket of Westeros, a land of rolling fields and golden harvests. But Oldtown is its heart, and the Hightowers are the pulse that keeps it beating. They are not a house that conquered its way to prominence through bloody fields of battle. They are a house that grew wealthy by controlling the flow of goods, of ideas, and of faith. Long before the Targaryens ever set foot on Dragonstone, the Hightowers were already ancient. They claim descent from the first men, from the days when the great fortress of the Hightower was first raised upon the island of Battle Isle. Legend says it was built by the Maze-makers, a people lost to time, but the Hightowers have held it for 10,000 years. That is not a number to be taken literally, perhaps, but it speaks to a truth that the other great houses of Westeros cannot claim. The Starks remember the Long Night. The Lannisters remember the Andal invasion. The Hightowers remember when the world was younger, and they were already there. This antiquity gives them a peculiar kind of prestige. They are not kings, though they have been offered crowns. They have stood beside the Gardeners, the old kings of the Reach, not as subjects but as partners. When Aegon the Conqueror came, the Hightowers did not fight him. They opened their gates, they bent the knee, and they were rewarded with continued prosperity. It was a pattern they had followed before. They understood that true power does not always need to sit on a throne. Sometimes it is better to be the hand that guides the throne, the voice that whispers in the king's ear, the purse that funds the army. And that is the key to understanding why the Hightowers can stand beside great lords without wearing a crown. They have built their dynasty on 4 pillars, each one as strong as the next. The first pillar is commerce. Oldtown is the largest city in Westeros, a hub of trade that connects the Reach to the Summer Sea, to the Free Cities, to the far corners of the known world. The Hightowers control the port, the tariffs, the markets. They do not need to mine gold like the Lannisters. They simply take a small piece of every transaction that flows through their city, and over centuries, that small piece becomes an ocean of wealth. The second pillar is religion. Oldtown is the seat of the faith of the Seven. The Starry Sept, before the Great Sept of Baelor was built in King's Landing, was the holiest site in all of Westeros. The Hightowers have always been close to the faith, patronizing its institutions, marrying into its most devout families, and ensuring that the voice of the gods speaks in harmony with their own interests. When the High Septon speaks, the Hightowers listen, and when the Hightowers speak, the High Septon listens. The third pillar is knowledge. The Citadel, the home of the Maesters, is located in Oldtown. It is the center of learning for the entire continent. Every lord who wants a Maester in his castle must send his sons to the Citadel to be trained. And the Citadel, for all its claims of neutrality, is deeply intertwined with the Hightowers. The Hightowers have funded its libraries, its laboratories, its raveneries. They have placed their own family members within its ranks. The Maesters may serve the realm, but they are forged in the shadow of the Hightower. The fourth pillar is marriage. The Hightowers have married into nearly every great house in Westeros, at one point or another. They have wed Starks, Lannisters, Tyrells, Targaryens. They have woven themselves into the fabric of the realm through blood and alliance. When Otto Hightower became Hand of the King to Viserys I, it was not a sudden rise. It was the culmination of centuries of careful placement. And when his daughter Alicent became queen, the Hightowers did not just gain a voice at court. They gained a claim to the Iron Throne itself. This is the house that Ormund Hightower was born into. He did not need to build it. He simply needed to wield it. And he did so with a cold, calculating precision that made him one of the most dangerous men of his age. He was not a warrior in the traditional sense, though he carried Vigilance, a Valyrian steel blade that marked him as a lord of immense status. He was a strategist, a planner, a man who understood that wars are won not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet moments before the fighting begins. He studied histories, collected tapestries, and surrounded himself with scholars. He was educated, refined, and utterly ruthless. When the Dance of the Dragons erupted, Ormund did not hesitate. He was already tied to the Green cause through his uncle Otto and his cousin Alicent. He saw the war not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. The Reach was the most populous and wealthy region in Westeros, and the Hightowers controlled its greatest city. Ormund raised an army of 15,000 men, the largest standing force left in the realm at that stage of the war. He marched them under the banner of the Hightower, a beacon of white stone against a field of red, and he brought with him not just swords and spears, but the full weight of Oldtown's infrastructure. His genius was patience. He did not seek glory on the battlefield. He sought to grind his enemies down through superior logistics, through careful planning, through the kind of war that is fought on ledgers and maps, as much as on fields of blood. He could appear compliant when forced, bending to circumstances, but always with a contingency in place, always thinking 3 moves ahead. That is what made him dangerous. That is what made him the Green's most reliable military pillar in the south. And yet, for all his power, Ormund was not a king. He did not want to be. The Hightowers have never needed a crown to shape the destiny of Westeros. They have been content to let others sit on thrones, while they pull the strings from the shadows. It is a strategy that has served them for 10,000 years. And as the Dance of the Dragons raged, Ormund Hightower was the living embodiment of that strategy. He was the house beneath the tower, the foundation upon which the Green cause was built. But even the strongest foundation can crack under the weight of dragonfire. And as Ormund prepared to march his army toward the decisive battles of the war, he knew that the coming conflict would test not just his military skill, but the very survival of his house. The Hightower had stood for millennia, but the dance would determine whether it would stand for another. And so we return to Oldtown, a city that has stood for thousands of years, its foundations laid in the dawn of the first men. But for all its ancient stones and accumulated wisdom, the Hightower family was about to make a play that would pull them directly into the heart of the most devastating war the Targaryen dynasty would ever know. The Dance of the Dragons did not begin when armies clashed or when the first dragon fell from the sky. It began decades earlier, in the quiet corridors of the Red Keep, with a single appointment. That appointment was made by King Jaehaerys I, the old king, near the end of his long reign. He needed a new hand of the king, someone to manage the realm's affairs as his own health began to fail, and he chose a man from Oldtown, a second son of House Hightower named Otto. Otto Hightower was not the lord of his house. That title belonged to his elder brother, but Otto was sharp, ambitious, and deeply educated in the histories and laws of the Seven Kingdoms. He had served as a master of laws before being elevated to the Hand's position, and from that moment, the Hightower family was no longer simply a powerful presence in the Reach. They were embedded in the very machinery of the Iron Throne. Now, to understand how this connects to Ormund Hightower, you need to see the family tree clearly. Otto Hightower was the brother of the Lord of Oldtown, and that lord was Ormund's father. This makes Otto Ormund's uncle, and when Otto's daughter, Alicent Hightower, became queen to King Viserys I, she became Ormund's cousin. So Ormund was not some distant relative living in the shadow of the Hightower. He was the nephew of the Hand of the King, and the first cousin of the Queen herself. That is a direct line to the throne. A connection that placed the entire Hightower family at the centre of the succession crisis that would tear the realm apart. When Viserys took the throne, Otto Hightower remained as Hand, a position of immense influence, and he used that influence to advance his family's interests, which were, in his mind, the same as the realm's interests. He saw the Targaryen dynasty as a tool, a vessel for order and stability, and he believed that the Hightowers were the best administrators to guide that vessel. But the seeds of conflict were already being planted. Viserys had named his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir, but when he married Alicent and she gave him sons, the succession became a powder keg. Otto was among the first to whisper that a queen regnant would be an affront to tradition, that a son should always come before a daughter. These were not just political opinions, they were the opening moves in a game that would end in fire and blood. And here is where Ormund Hightower enters the picture, not as a young lord yet, but as a member of this family network that was tightening its grip on the crown. He grew up hearing the stories of his uncle Otto's rise, of the Queen's influence, of the power that Oldtown could wield through its sons and daughters. He was educated in the same traditions, trained in the same politics, and he learned to see the world through the same lens. That order was fragile, that power had to be seized and held, and that the Hightower name was a weapon as sharp as any Valyrian steel blade. When Viserys finally died, the succession crisis exploded. Rhaenyra was crowned on Dragonstone, but in King's Landing, Otto Hightower moved quickly. He had been dismissed as Hand years earlier, but he was still the Queen's father, still the Master of Whispers, and with the support of the small council, he placed Aegon II on the throne. The Greens had their king, and the Hightower family had its war. But the dance did not begin with the coronation. It began with every dinner, every council meeting, every whispered conversation in the years before. It began when Otto Hightower first looked at the Iron Throne and saw a seat that could be filled by his own blood. It began when a family from Oldtown decided that they would not simply serve the dragons, but would ride alongside them, steering the course of history. And that is the context you need to understand Ormund Hightower. He was not a man who stumbled into war. He was born into a family that had been preparing for this moment for a generation. His uncle had laid the foundation, his cousin sat on the throne, and he, the Lord of Oldtown, would be called upon to marshal the full strength of the Reach to defend that throne. The armies had not yet marched, the dragons had not yet burned, but the dance had already begun in the minds of the men who would command it. From here, we must turn our attention to the man himself, to the Lord who would take up the sword Vigilance and lead the Hightower host into the fires of civil war. Ormund Hightower was not a warrior by nature, but he was a strategist, a scholar, and a man of cold, calculated ambition. And in the chaos that followed, he would prove to be one of the Green's most dangerous weapons. From the shadow of the Hand's Tower in King's Landing, we must now travel south, down the Rosa Road, past the fields and orchards of the Reach, until we reach the mouth of the Honeywine. Here the air changes. It carries salt from the sunset sea, incense from 100 shrines, and the old, patient weight of stone that has stood for thousands of years. This is Oldtown, and its lord is Ormund Hightower. It is one thing to be a power behind the throne in the capital. It is quite another to actually sit upon the seat of your own ancient domain. Otto Hightower served 3 kings, but he was always a guest in the Red Keep, a servant of the crown who wore the Hand's badge. His nephew, Ormund, inherited something far more concrete. He inherited the city itself. Every dock, every warehouse, every guild hall, every starry sept and black stone fortress that makes Oldtown the true heart of Westerosi civilization now answers to him. He is not merely a lord in name. He is the lord of the second largest city in the realm, the head of a house that predates the Targaryens, and the keeper of a legacy that rivals the Iron Throne itself in sheer continuity. But an inheritance is never just a gift, it is a burden, and Ormund's burden is immense. He takes control of Oldtown at a moment when the realm is fracturing. The king is dying, the succession is disputed, and his own family is split between the capital and the Hightower, between the courtly ambitions of his uncle Otto and the martial duties of the Reach. Ormund must hold together a city that is home to the Faith, the Citadel, and a dozen powerful merchant houses, all of whom have their own agendas. He must manage his own kin, including sons who will one day inherit this weight, an award in the form of Prince Daeron Targaryen, the youngest son of the king, sent south for safety and education. Every decision Ormund makes is watched. Every alliance he forges is scrutinized. He cannot afford a single misstep. And yet, you compare him to the more visible figures of the Green faction, Ormund seems almost quiet. In King's Landing, you have Sir Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, whose white cloak is a banner of defiance. You have Lord Larys Strong, the clubfoot, who whispers secrets in the shadows of the Red Keep. You have Prince Aemond, who rides the largest dragon in the world, and whose eye patch makes him a figure of legend before he ever draws a sword. These men command attention. They dominate court gossip. They are the faces of the Green cause. Ormund Hightower, by contrast, remains in Oldtown. He does not sit on the small council. He does not lead the royal guard. He does not fly a dragon. To the casual observer, he might seem like a secondary player, a regional lord who sends his levies when called, and otherwise tends to his own lands. But that impression is a dangerous mistake. Ormund's authority is not built on spectacle, it is built on preparation. While the knights of the Kingsguard train in the yard, Ormund studies maps of the Reach and calculates supply lines. While the courtiers scheme over cups of Dornish wine, Ormund reviews the accounts of the Hightower treasury and ensures that every silver stag is accounted for. While the dragons cast their shadows over the capital, Ormund quietly arms the largest standing army left in the southern kingdoms. He does not need to shout his loyalty to Aegon II. He proves it through action, through the steady accumulation of resources, men, and strategic position. He is the kind of lord who wins a war before the first battle is ever fought, simply by making sure that when the call comes, his forces are ready, his granaries are full, and his alliances are secure. This is the inheritance that Ormund Hightower bears. It is not a crown, it is not a throne. It is a city of 1,000,000 souls, a family of ambitious and capable kin, and a loyalty that must be divided between the demands of the crown and the needs of his own domain. He must serve King Aegon, but he must also protect Oldtown. He must honour his uncle Otto, but he must also raise his own sons to lead. He must be seen as a loyal bannerman, but he must also be prepared to act independently if the realm falls into chaos. It is a delicate balance, and Ormund walks it with the cold precision of a man who has spent his life learning the weight of every step. And so, as the dance of the dragons begins to unfold, Ormund Hightower does not rush to King's Landing to claim a seat at the table. He stays in Oldtown, at the base of the great tower that bears his name, and he prepares. He gathers his bannermen. He sharpens his Valyrian steel blade, Vigilance, which has been passed down through generations of Hightower lords. He watches the horizon, not for dragons, but for the first signs of the storm that will soon sweep across the Reach. Because Ormund knows that in a war between dragons, the ground still belongs to the men who hold it, and he intends to hold his ground with an iron grip. That grip will soon extend beyond the walls of Oldtown, reaching toward the fields and rivers where the fate of the Reach will be decided. The armies are gathering. The roads are filling with soldiers and supplies, and the quiet lord of the Hightower is about to become the most dangerous man the Greens have yet deployed. Ormund Hightower inherited a city that had been accumulating power for thousands of years, but he also inherited something far less tangible and far more dangerous. He inherited a reputation. The Hightowers of Oldtown were not merely wealthy. They were the keepers of the realm's oldest memories, the patrons of its greatest scholars, and the silent architects of its most enduring institutions. To be the Lord of Oldtown was to be judged by a standard that measured not just gold or swords, but the depth of one's learning and the weight of one's lineage. And Ormund, by all accounts, understood this burden with a clarity that bordered on obsession. He was not a man who wore his intellect lightly. Those who met him in the great hall of the Hightower, beneath the pale stone arches that had stood since, before the Targaryens crossed the narrow sea, often remarked on the stillness of his gaze. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried the precision of a man who had spent years weighing each syllable before releasing it into the world. His chambers were not filled with the trophies of war or the gaudy displays of wealth that lesser lords used to announce their importance. Instead, the walls of his private study were lined with shelves of leather-bound histories, some so old that their spines had crumbled to dust, their pages preserved only by the careful hands of maesters who had served House Hightower for generations. And then there were the tapestries. Ormund collected them with a passion that bordered on reverence. They were not mere decorations, they were records. Woven into their threads were the stories of battles fought before the Doom, the genealogies of houses that had faded into legend, and the maps of kingdoms that no longer existed. He would spend hours tracing the patterns with his fingers, reading the fabric as another man might read a scroll. To him, these tapestries were a form of memory that could not be altered or erased, a testament to the truth of what had been, preserved against the lies of what men wished to believe. This love of history was not idle curiosity. In a realm obsessed with ancestry, where every claim to power rested on the bones of the dead, knowledge of the past was the sharpest weapon a man could wield. Ormund understood that the dance of the dragons would not be decided solely by dragons or armies. It would be decided by who could prove their right to rule, and proof in Westeros was a matter of record. The Targaryens had their dragons, but the Hightowers had the archives. They had the chronicles, the treaties, the marriage contracts, and the genealogies that stretched back to the dawn of the first men. When a lord questioned the legitimacy of a claim, Ormund could produce a document that settled the matter before the first sword was drawn. When a rival house tried to assert an ancient right, Ormund could point to a tapestry that showed the truth of the original agreement. He did not need to shout or threaten. He simply needed to know more than the other man. And yet, for all his cultivation, Ormund harboured a deep and simmering contempt for those who mistook brutality for intelligence. He had seen too many lords rise to power through violence alone, only to crumble when faced with a problem that could not be solved by swinging a sword. He considered such men not just dangerous, but foolish. They were like children playing with fire, unable to see that the flames they lit would eventually consume them. Ormund's own father taught him that true power came from patience, from the ability to wait for the right moment, and from the willingness to let an enemy defeat themselves. A man who acted out of anger was a man who had already lost, because he had surrendered control of his own mind. This philosophy shaped every aspect of Ormund's rule. When he took in Daeron Targaryen as a ward after the prince's father died, he did not do so out of simple charity or political calculation. He did it because he understood that the boy represented the future of the green cause, and that the best way to secure that future was to shape the prince's mind while he was still young. Ormund did not merely teach Daeron the arts of war. He taught him the value of history, the importance of precedent, and the subtle art of reading a room. He wanted the prince to understand that a crown was not won by force alone, but by the careful accumulation of legitimacy. One document, one marriage, one alliance at a time. The same careful thinking guided Ormund's relationship with his own children. He had 3 sons and a daughter, each of whom he trained according to their strengths. Lionel, his eldest, was groomed for command, but not the kind of command that relied on shouting orders from a horse. Ormund taught him to read the terrain of politics as well as the terrain of battle, to see the hidden currents that moved beneath the surface of every negotiation. Martin, his second son, was given over to the study of law and administration, because Ormund knew that a house that could not manage its own accounts would soon find itself in debt to someone else. And Garmund, the youngest, was encouraged to pursue the histories, to become the keeper of the family's memory, so that the Hightowers would never forget who they were or where they came from. But it was in the quiet moments, when the torches burned low and the city of Oldtown settled into the rhythm of the night, that Ormund's true nature revealed itself. He would sit alone in his study, a single candle flickering on the desk before him, and read the old chronicles by its light. He was searching for patterns, for the hidden threads that connected one event to another across the centuries. He believed that history moved in cycles, that the same mistakes were made again and again by men who refused to learn from the past, and he was determined not to be one of those men. This was the Ormund Hightower that the Greens relied upon. Not a charismatic speaker who could rally a crowd, but a scholar who could outthink an enemy before they even knew they were being thought about. Not a warrior who led from the front, but a strategist who understood that the most important battles were fought in the minds of men, long before the first arrow was loosed. He was the kind of lord who could sit in a council chamber and say nothing for an hour, then speak a single sentence that changed the course of the discussion. He was the kind of man who could lose a battle and still win the war, because he had already planned for the defeat and built a path to recovery into his strategy. And yet, for all his learning and all his patience, Ormund was not a man without ambition. He knew that the Hightowers had once been kings in their own right, before the Targaryens united the realm under Dragonfire. He knew that Oldtown had been the seat of the faith, the centre of learning, and the heart of trade in Westeros for longer than the Iron Throne had existed. He did not want to restore the old kingdom of the Hightowers, but he did want to ensure that his house remained indispensable to whoever sat on the throne. And in the chaos of the dance, with dragons fighting dragons and brothers killing brothers, Ormund saw an opportunity to cement that indispensability forever. So he gathered his forces, not with the fanfare of a conqueror, but with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He called in favours, he reviewed the old treaties, and he made sure that every lord in the Reach understood exactly what the Hightowers could offer and what they would demand in return. He did not threaten or bluster. He simply reminded them of the debts they owed, the alliances they had sworn, and the histories that bound their houses to his. And when the time came to march, his army was the largest standing force left in the realm, nearly 15,000 men, all of them loyal to the Hightower and the Green cause. But even as he prepared for war, Ormund never stopped thinking. He never stopped reading. He never stopped looking for the hidden pattern that would give him the advantage, because he knew that in the end, the dance would not be won by the man who struck the hardest blow, but by the man who understood the story that was being told. And Ormund Hightower intended to be the one who wrote the final chapter. And so we come to the face that Ormund Hightower showed the world. For all his learning, for all his hours spent among dusty chronicles and woven histories, the Lord of Oldtown understood that power was not merely a matter of what you knew. It was a matter of what you allowed others to see. And what Ormund allowed others to see was a man of duty, of order, of unwavering loyalty to crown and kin. He was, by all public accounts, the ideal great lord. When he walked the streets of Oldtown, he did so with the measured gravity of a man who knew his city was watching. He attended the sept with regularity, offered patronage to the citadel, and presided over feasts and audiences with a courteous patience that seemed almost rehearsed. To the small folk, he was a distant but reassuring figure, the lord who kept the granaries full and the trade routes open. To his bannermen, he was a steady hand, a man who listened before he spoke and who never made a promise he could not keep. To the court in King's Landing, he was the faithful kinsman of Queen Alicent, the nephew of Otto Hightower, a lord who had taken in the young Prince Daeron as a ward and raised him with all the honour expected of a great house. On the surface, there was nothing to fault, but the surface, as Ormund knew better than most, was a tapestry of its own design. And like any good tapestry, it had a reverse side, one that few were permitted to see. Those who served closest to him spoke of a different man. They spoke of the flash of temper that could darken his face in an instant, the cold stillness that fell over him when he received unwelcome news. They spoke of the way he could dismiss a servant with a single glance, not with cruelty, but with a finality that left no room for appeal. There were reports, difficult to verify but persistent, that Ormund's private chambers contained more than just books and maps. There were letters, carefully filed, that recorded the debts and failures of men who had crossed him. And there were whispers, never loud enough to reach the public square, that the Lord of Oldtown had a long memory and a longer reach. This was the essential contradiction of Ormund Hightower. He was a man who could sit at a council table and speak of mercy, of justice, of the need to preserve the realm's peace, while in the same breath dispatching a rider with orders that would ensure no such mercy was ever needed. He was a man who could smile at a rival lord, offer him wine and warm words, and then weeks later arrange for that same lord's supply lines to dry up, his allies to be courted away, his reputation to be quietly eroded by a dozen small deniable acts. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to draw his sword. He simply needed to wait and to plan and to let the world see only what he wished it to see. This ability to appear calm while arranging harsher outcomes was not a skill he had learned overnight. It was the product of a lifetime spent in the shadow of the Hightower, watching the ebb and flow of power in Oldtown streets and in the Red Keep's corridors. He had seen Otto Hightower rise and fall and rise again, had watched his cousin Alicent navigate the treacherous currents of a royal court, had observed the fates of men who acted too quickly or spoke too freely, and he had drawn the only conclusion that a man of his intelligence could draw, that the most dangerous weapon in any lord's arsenal was not a Valyrian steel blade, but a reputation for predictability. So Ormund cultivated that reputation with care. He was seen as the dutiful lord, the faithful kinsman, the defender of order. When the realm began to fracture, when the succession crisis loomed and the whispers of war grew louder, He did not rush to declare himself. He waited. He listened. He let others commit to their positions first, while he remained the calm, reasonable figure in the background, the man who could be counted on to do the right thing. And when he finally did move, it was with the quiet precision of a scholar turning a page, not the bluster of a warrior drawing a blade. But those who knew him best understood that the courtesy was a mask, and the calculation beneath it was relentless. Ormund Hightower did not forgive. He did not forget. He simply filed away every slight, every failure, every moment of weakness in another man, and waited for the moment when that knowledge would become useful. He was, in every sense, a man who played the long game, and he played it with a patience that bordered on the inhuman. And yet, for all his private ruthlessness, he never lost sight of the public image he had so carefully constructed. He knew that a lord who was feared too openly was a lord who invited rebellion. A lord who was hated too widely was a lord who would find himself alone when the swords were drawn. So he balanced his coldness with courtesy, his calculation with charm, his ambition with the appearance of service. He was in the end a man who understood that the face he showed the world was not a lie. It was simply one truth among many, the truth that served him best. And as the realm moved closer to war, as the Greens and the Blacks prepared to tear each other apart, that face would prove to be one of the most valuable assets House Hightower possessed. For in the chaos to come, the men who could keep their composure, who could smile while they sharpened their knives, who could appear to be the very pillars of order while quietly dismantling the foundations of their enemies, those were the men who would survive. And Ormund Hightower intended not only to survive, but to see his house endure, to see his city prosper, to see the name Hightower written into the history of the realm in letters that would never fade. But before he could secure that legacy, he would have to march. He would have to raise the banners of Oldtown, gather the strength of the Reach, and lead his men into a war that would test every lesson he had ever learned. The scholar lord, the patient planner, the master of the public face, would soon have to prove that his private ruthlessness was more than a rumour whispered in the shadows of his own hall. He would have to prove it on the battlefield, where the only mask that mattered was the one that could stop a blade. We have seen the face Ormund Hightower shows the world, the dutiful lord, the faithful kinsman, the defender of order. We have also glimpsed the temper beneath, the private ruthlessness that suggests a man who is never quite what he appears. But to truly understand Ormund, we must understand the object that best embodies his house and his philosophy. We must speak of the sword. In the armories of the Hightower, in a vault that has not been opened for a ceremony in living memory, there rests a blade of Valyrian steel. It is called Vigilance, and like the tower that gives his house its name, this sword is not merely a weapon. It is a statement carved in metal, a claim written in the dark ripples of dragon-forged steel. Most great houses of Westeros possess a Valyrian steel blade. The Starks have ice, the Lannisters have Brightraw, though that one is lost, and later they will come to possess Widow's Wail. The Targaryens have Blackfire and Dark Sister. These are swords of conquest, of battle, of the king's justice delivered in a single, terrible stroke. But Vigilance is different. It was never meant to be the first sword drawn in a war. It was meant to be the last. The name itself tells you everything about the Hightower approach to power. Vigilance, not fury, not conquest, not even dawn, with its promise of a new beginning. Vigilance is the quality of a sentry who does not sleep, of a lord who does not forget, of a house that watches the tides of history from its tower and waits for the moment to act. It is a patient name, a dangerous name. The sword's history is not one of famous battles or legendary duels. There is no tale of a Hightower champion cleaving a rival lord in two at a tourney. No song of a desperate last stand where Vigilance was raised to rally a broken line. Instead, the blade has been passed down through generations as a symbol of something quieter and perhaps more enduring: legitimacy. In a world where power is so often taken by force, The Hightowers have always understood that the appearance of rightness is a weapon in itself, and a Valyrian steel sword, ancient and irreplaceable, is one of the most powerful proofs of that rightness a house can possess. Consider what it means to hold such a blade during a civil war. When the realm fractures, when lords choose sides and oaths are broken, the question of who is the true king becomes a matter of life and death. Armies can be raised and lost, gold can be spent and borrowed, but a Valyrian steel sword is a fixed point in the chaos. It is an heirloom that predates the conflict, that will outlast it, that connects the present lord to a lineage stretching back before the conquest itself. To wield vigilance is to say, without words, that your house was great before this war began and will be great after it ends. It is a claim that cannot be refuted by a defeat in the field. For Ormund, then, the sword is not a tool for personal glory. It is a symbol of the Hightower's ancient status, a reminder to every lord in the Reach that Oldtown is not merely another city. It is the seat of the faith, the home of the Citadel, the oldest continuous settlement in Westeros, and its lord carries a blade that has watched over that city for centuries. The name Vigilance is a philosophy made physical. It is the governing principle of Ormund's life. Watch, wait, and strike at the right moment. This is not the philosophy of a hot-headed warrior. It is the philosophy of a scholar who has studied the histories and knows that rash action has undone more houses than any enemy army. It is the philosophy of a lord who collects tapestries and old climps, who sees the long game in every political maneuver. Ormund does not need to be the first to draw his sword. He needs to be the one who draws it at the moment that matters most. And that moment is coming. The Dance of the Dragons is not a war that will be won by a single charge or a single duel. It will be won by the side that can endure, that can outlast its enemies, that can hold its nerve while the dragons burn and the armies bleed. The Greens have dragons of their own, of course, but they also have something the Blacks may underestimate: the infrastructure of Oldtown, the wealth of the Hightowers, and the cold patience of a lord who has spent his life learning to wait. When Ormund finally does march to war, he will not do so as a young knight seeking fame. He will do so as the head of a house that has been preparing for this conflict since before he was born, and he will carry vigilance not as a weapon to be swung wildly, but as a banner to be seen. The ripples in the steel will catch the light, and every lord who sees it will remember that the Hightowers have been here before. They have watched kingdoms rise and fall. They have kept their counsel and their swords. And now, when the realm needs a pillar of stability, they are ready to act. The sword's presence at Ormund's side will be a constant reminder of the weight he carries. It is not just the weight of the blade itself, but the weight of his house's history, his family's ambitions, and his own carefully constructed reputation. Every decision he makes, every army he commands, every alliance he forges will be judged against the standards set by that name: vigilance. He must be watchful. He must be patient. He must strike only when the moment is perfect. And so, as we turn from the symbol of the sword to the man who wields it, we begin to see how Ormund will apply this philosophy to the brutal realities of war. The blade is a statement, but the hand that holds it must be steady. The mind that commands it must be cold, and the war that awaits him will test both to their limits. For now, vigilance rests in its vault, waiting, but soon it will be drawn. Vigilance was never meant to be held by a man alone. The Valyrian steel blade of House Hightower, ancient and dark as the black stone of the Battle Isle, was a symbol of the Thumsea's continuity, a reminder that the Hightower name would outlast any single lord, and Ormund Hightower, the current bearer of that sword, understood this better than most. He knew that his legacy would not be measured in battles won or treaties signed, but in the children he left behind to carry that name forward. In a time of war, those children were not just heirs, they were weapons, alliances, and hostages, all at once. Ormund had 3 sons and at least 1 daughter, each one a piece on a board far larger than any single family. The eldest was Lionel, the heir to Oldtown and the Hightower seat. Lionel was born to inherit the weight of his father's ambition, the city's wealth, and the sword Vigilance itself, should he prove worthy. But in the Dance of the Dragons, being the eldest son of a Green Lord meant more than just waiting for a title. It meant leading men into battle, commanding the loyalty of bannermen, and standing as a living symbol of the family's commitment to Aegon II's cause. Lionel was raised in the shadow of war, trained to be a soldier as much as a lord, because the Greens needed every able-bodied noble they could muster. Then there was Martin, the second son. In many noble houses, a second son was often destined for the maester's chain, the faith, or a minor lordship through marriage. But the Hightowers were not a house that wasted assets. Martin was groomed for command as well, a spare heir in case Lionel fell, but also a commander in his own right. The Reach was the breadbasket of Westeros, and its armies were among the largest in the realm. Ormund needed officers he could trust, men who shared his blood and his vision. Martin was one of those men, a piece of the family's military infrastructure, trained to lead Hightower levies and hold the line against any threat to the Green cause. The youngest son was Garmund, and here the pattern shifted. Garmund was not the heir, nor was he likely to command armies in the same way as his brothers, but he was still a Hightower, and that name carried weight. In the complex web of marriages and wards that define noble politics, Garmund could be used to bind another house to the Hightowers, to secure a loyalty, or to fill a gap in the family's influence. He was young, but in a war for inheritance, even the youngest children were part of the calculation. Every son was a potential alliance, a future lord, a future commander, or a future hostage. And then there was Bethany Hightower, Ormund's daughter. In the histories of the dance, daughters are often footnotes, mentioned only in the context of their marriages. But Bethany was more than a name on a genealogy. She was a Hightower, and in a house that had produced a queen, a hand of the king, and the wealthiest lord in the Reach, a daughter was a diplomatic asset of immense value. Bethany's marriage would be a treaty, a promise of alliance, a way to secure a powerful house to the Green cause. She was not just a child. She was a piece of the family's future, a living bond between Oldtown and whatever house her father chose to honour with her hand. In a war where every sword mattered, a well-placed marriage could be worth 1,000 men. But beneath all this dynastic calculation lay a personal tragedy that shaped Ormund's family more than any political manoeuvre. Ormund's first wife, the mother of all his children, had died in childbirth. The exact circumstances are lost to the records, but the pattern is familiar enough. She gave life to a child, and in doing so lost her own. For Ormund, that loss was not just a personal wound, it was a disruption to his plans. A lord needed a consort, a partner in the management of his household, and the continuation of his line. A death left a void, one that he eventually filled by marrying Samantha Tarly, a woman from a powerful Reach house. But the first wife's death lingered, a reminder that even the most careful planning could be undone by the cruel randomness of life. That loss also meant that Ormund's children grew up without their mother. Lionel, Martin, Garmund, and Bethany were raised in a household where the Lord's attention was divided between his duties, his ambitions, and his grief. They were shaped by a father who saw them as heirs to a legacy, but also as instruments of a cause. The Hightower children were not allowed the luxury of childhood. They were trained, educated, and positioned from the moment they walked. Every lesson, every marriage negotiation, every military appointment was a step in a larger plan, and that plan was war. The Dance of the Dragons was not a conflict that allowed neutrality. Every house in Westeros was forced to choose a side, and the Hightowers had chosen the Greens. That choice meant that Ormund's children were not just heirs to a peaceful lordship, they were heirs to a wartime legacy. Lionel would lead men into battle, Martin would command troops in the field, Garmund would be married or warded to secure alliances, Bethany would be betrothed to bind a house to the Green cause. Every one of them was a political asset, a piece of the Hightower power that Ormund had spent his life building. In this, Ormund was no different from any other lord of his time. The noble families of Westeros treated their children as extensions of their own will, tools to be used in the great game of thrones. But the Hightowers were more ruthless than most, because they had more to lose. Oldtown was the wealthiest city in the realm, the seat of the faith, the home of the citadel. The Hightowers were not just lords, they were the guardians of a cultural and economic heartland. If they fell, the Reach would fall with them. And so Ormund's children were raised not just to inherit, but to fight, to scheme, and to survive. The death of his first wife had taught Ormund a hard lesson, that the future was never guaranteed. He could not rely on luck or fate to preserve his house. He had to build, plan, and prepare for every contingency. And the most important contingency was the succession. Lionel, Martin, Garmund, and Bethany were not just his children. They were his legacy, the living continuation of the Hightower name. If he failed in the war, they would be the ones to carry on the fight. If he succeeded, they would be the ones to enjoy the spoils. But the war was not kind to heirs. The dance of the dragons consumed lords and soldiers alike, and the Hightower sons were no exception. They would be tested in ways that no training could fully prepare them for. And Bethany, the daughter, would find her fate tied to the shifting alliances of a conflict that cared little for the lives of women. In a house as dangerous as the Hightowers, every child was a target, every marriage a potential trap, every inheritance a battlefield. Ormund knew this. He had built his family with the same cold calculation that he applied to his military campaigns. He had chosen his wife for her bloodline, raised his sons for command, and positioned his daughter for a marriage that would strengthen the green cause. He had done everything a lord could do to secure his house's future. But the dance of the dragons was not a war that rewarded careful planning. It was a war of fire and blood, and in such a war, even the most precious children could be consumed. The Hightower children were heirs to a wartime legacy, and that legacy would demand everything from them. Lionel, Martin, Garmund, and Bethany were not just names in a genealogy. They were the living instruments of Ormund's ambition, the next generation of a house that had stood for thousands of years. And as the war unfolded, they would be forced to prove that they were worthy of that legacy, or be destroyed by it. The weight of that inheritance pressed down on them from the moment they were born. And as Ormund looked out from the Hightower, the sword Vigilance at his side, he knew that his children were not just his hope for the future. They were his hostages to fortune, his gamble in a game where the stakes were nothing less than the survival of his house. The dance of the dragons would test them all, and only time would tell which of them would rise and which would fall. And so, with his children established and his household taking shape around the burdens of succession, Ormund Hightower turned to a matter that would define the next phase of his life and the political orientation of Oldtown itself. He needed a wife. His first wife, the mother of his children, had died in childbirth, leaving him a widower for years. But Ormund was not a man to let personal loss cloud strategic necessity. He understood that a lord's marriage was never simply a private arrangement. It was a treaty, a bond, a public statement of alliance. And in the years leading up to the Dance of the Dragons, no alliance mattered more than the one he forged with House Tarly. Her name was Samantha Tarly. She came from Hornhill, the ancient seat of a house renowned throughout the Reach for its military discipline, its hard practicality, and its unyielding sense of honour. The Tarlys were not the wealthiest house in the Reach, nor the most politically subtle, but they were, without question, among the most feared. Their reputation rested on centuries of battlefield prowess, on a martial tradition that valued competence over charm, and on Heartsbane, their own Valyrian steel greatsword, which had been carried by Tarly lords for generations. To marry a Tarly was to marry into that reputation, and for Ormund Hightower, a man who built his power on infrastructure, on planning, on the quiet accumulation of influence, the Tarlys offered something he could not buy with gold alone. They offered credible military strength. The marriage bound Oldtown more tightly to the martial nobility of the Reach, in a way that no treaty or trade agreement could match. The Hightowers had always been the great commercial and scholarly power of the region, the lords of the Citadel and the Starry Sept, the masters of the great port city that sat at the mouth of the Honeywine. But the Reach was also home to houses like the Tyrells, the Florents, the Oakharts, and the Rowans, families whose power rested on swords and spears as much as on coin and parchment. By wedding Samantha Tarly, Ormund signalled that he was not content to remain merely the richest lord in the Reach. He intended to be one of its most formidable, a man whose household could command armies as easily as it could commission tapestries. Samantha herself was a figure of considerable substance, though the records of her life are sparse, as is often the case with noblewomen of the period. What we know suggests she was practical, resilient, and utterly loyal to her new house. She came to Oldtown not as a passive bride, but as a partner in Ormund's grand design. Together, they transformed the Hightower household from a family home into something far more purposeful. The great tower of Oldtown had always been a centre of commerce, of learning, of religious authority, but under Ormund and Samantha, it became a command centre. The halls that had once echoed with the debates of maesters and the chants of septons now filled with the clatter of armour, the murmur of war councils, the steady flow of ravens carrying dispatches to every corner of the Reach. This shift was not accidental. Ormund's household was becoming a machine for war, and Samantha was its quiet steward. She managed the logistics of a lord's life that no longer had room for leisure. She oversaw the storage of grain, the distribution of supplies, the care of horses and weapons. She ensured that when Ormund called his banners, the men would find their armour ready, their rations packed, their orders clear. In this she embodied the Tarly reputation for hard practicality. The Tarleys did not waste time on courtly games. They prepared, they trained, they endured, and Samantha brought that ethos to the Hightower table, tempering Ormund's scholarly patience with a soldier's sense of urgency. The marriage also carried a deeper political meaning. By aligning himself with the Tarleys, Ormund was sending a message to the other great houses of the Reach. He was not merely the nephew of the Hand of the King, not merely the cousin of the Queen. He was a lord who could command the loyalty of one of the region's most respected martial houses. The Tarleys were not easily swayed. They had their own ambitions, their own pride, their own ancient claims. But Samantha's marriage to Ormund bound them to the Hightower cause in a way that no oath of fealty could match. It was a bond of blood, and in the world of Westeros, blood was the most binding currency of all. And so, as the realm drifted toward war, Ormund Hightower found himself in a position of extraordinary strength. He had the wealth of Oldtown behind him. He had the sword Vigilance at his side. He had sons to carry his name and a daughter to weave into the web of alliances. And he had a wife from a house that knew how to fight. The household he built with Samantha Tarly was not just a family. It was a war council, a supply depot, a command post. Every decision they made, every letter they sent, every store of grain they secured was a preparation for the storm to come. But even as Ormund consolidated his power in the Reach, he knew that the coming conflict would not be fought only with swords and supplies. It would be fought with loyalty, with patience, with the ability to read the moves of enemies who were just as clever as he was. And so, while he strengthened his household, he also watched. He watched the court in King's Landing, where his uncle Otto manoeuvred for influence. He watched the lords of the Reach, weighing their allegiances, testing their resolve. He watched the Targaryens themselves, those dragon riders whose power seemed absolute, but whose family was already fracturing from within. And he waited, because Ormund Hightower understood that the most dangerous move in any game was the one that looked like patience. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. And so, from the marriage bed of Ormund Hightower and Samantha Tarly, we turn to another kind of bond, one forged not through vows but through upbringing. For the Hightowers, power was never merely a matter of blood or coin. It was also a matter of presence, and no presence in Oldtown was more significant in the years before the dance than that of a young prince of the blood, Daeron Targaryen. Prince Daeron was the third son of King Viserys I and Queen Alicent Hightower, while his elder brothers Aegon and Aemond remained at court in King's Landing. Daeron was sent to Oldtown as a ward of House Hightower. This was not an unusual practice among the great houses of Westeros. Wardship served multiple purposes. It was a gesture of trust, a means of education, and a form of hostage, all wrapped into one. But in this particular case, the arrangement carried weight far beyond the ordinary. Daeron was not sent to Oldtown simply to learn his letters, or to train at arms under a maester's eye. He was sent to be shaped. The Hightowers, led by Lord Ormond, were the most powerful family in the Reach, and they were also the Queen's own kin. By placing Daeron in their care, the Crown was making a statement. The prince would be raised among the towers of the Hightower, surrounded by the wealth, the history, and the influence of Oldtown. He would learn the ways of the Reach, its politics, its alliances, its grudges, and in time he would come to see the Hightowers not as distant relatives, but as his true family. This was the quiet genius of the arrangement. Wardship creates a loyalty that is more intimate than any formal alliance. A boy who grows up in your hall, who eats at your table, who trains with your sons, who learns to respect your authority and your wisdom. That boy will carry a piece of your house with him for the rest of his life. He will see the world through your eyes, or at least through a lens that you have helped to grind. And when the time comes for him to choose a side, you will not be choosing a distant faction. You will be choosing the people who raised him. For Ormund Hightower, Daeron was more than a ward. He was a living link between the Green Royal line and the power of Oldtown. The prince was a Targaryen, yes, but he was also a Hightower by blood and by upbringing. He was the embodiment of the alliance that the Greens had built, a bridge between the Iron Throne and the ancient city that had crowned kings since before the conquest. And Daeron himself was no mere figurehead. Even as a young man, he showed promise. He was said to be courteous, diligent, and skilled with a blade. He had a dragon of his own, a blue and copper beast named Tessarion, which he had claimed as a boy. But unlike his brothers, who were known for their tempers and their ambitions, Daeron seemed content to learn, to serve, and to wait. He was in many ways the perfect ward. He was loyal, capable, and unassuming. He did not chafe at the authority of his Hightower guardians. He did not scheme for power or position. He simply became one of them. This made him all the more valuable. When the war began, Daeron would not be a reluctant ally or a distant prince. He would be a son of Oldtown, raised in its shadow, loyal to its cause. And his presence in the city meant that the Hightowers could not be ignored. Oldtown was not just a source of gold and men. It was the home of a Targaryen prince, a dragon rider who could take to the skies at a moment's notice. Any enemy who looked south would have to reckon with that. The bond between Daeron and the Hightowers was not a matter of formal treaties or written agreements. It was something deeper, something woven into the fabric of daily life. It was the trust that comes from shared meals and shared lessons, from watching a boy grow into a man and knowing that you have had a hand in shaping him. And it was that trust, that intimacy, that made the Hightowers so dangerous once the war began. They did not need to command Daeron's loyalty. They had already earned it. As the realm fractured and the Greens prepared for conflict, Oldtown stood as a bastion of their power, and Daeron Targaryen stood at its heart. He was the prince who had been raised in the Hightower, the prince who would ride Tessarion into battle, the prince who would become known as Daeron the Daring. But before he earned that name, he was simply the ward, the boy who had grown up among the towers of Oldtown, shaped by the hands of a house that knew how to wait, how to plan, and how to strike. And in that shaping, The Greens had found one of their most loyal and capable weapons. Prince Daeron Targaryen had been in Oldtown for years, a ward of House Hightower, learning the ways of the Reach from Ormund himself. It was a bond built on proximity and shared routine, not just parchment and promise, but that bond was about to be tested in a way no one in the Hightower could have fully anticipated. Because in the spring of the 129th year after Aegon's conquest, King Viserys I died. The news did not travel fast in those days, but when it reached Oldtown, it landed like a stone dropped into still water. Viserys had been king for over a quarter century, a man who presided over a long peace, but who had also sown the seeds of a terrible division. For years he had named his daughter, Rhaenyra, as his heir. The lords of the realm had sworn oaths to her, but in the final years of his reign, the king's health had failed, and his court had shifted. His second wife, Queen Alicent, had gathered power around her and her children, and when Viserys breathed his last, the question of succession was no longer a matter of law or oath. It was a matter of who moved first. Alicent moved first. With the help of her father, Otto Hightower, who had served as Hand of the King, she placed her eldest son, Aegon II, upon the Iron Throne. The coronation was swift, held in the Dragon Pit, and the crown was placed on his head before Rhaenyra even knew her father was dead. The justification was simple enough. In the eyes of many, a son should come before a daughter, and Viserys had, in his final confused days, muttered something that could be interpreted as a change of heart. Whether that was true or convenient, it no longer mattered. The Greens had their king. Rhaenyra, meanwhile, was on Dragonstone when the Raven came. She had her own claim, her own sworn lords and her own dragons. She did not accept the usurpation. She called her own council, and she crowned herself queen. And so in a matter of days, the realm was split. Two monarchs, each with a crown, each with followers, each convinced of their own right. The dance of the dragons had begun. For House Hightower, this was not a distant political squabble. This was personal. Alicent was a Hightower. Her son was a Hightower on the throne. And Otto Hightower, the architect of the Green faction, was the family's most prominent voice at court. There was no room for neutrality. To stand aside would be to abandon their own blood, to surrender the influence they had spent decades building. And for Ormund, the Lord of Oldtown, there was no question which side he would take. He was not a man who hesitated when the stakes were clear. But Ormund's war was not simply a matter of family loyalty. It was also a defense of everything House Hightower had built. Oldtown was the oldest city in Westeros, the seat of the faith, the home of the Citadel. The Hightowers had ruled there for thousands of years, accumulating wealth, knowledge, and power. They had married into the royal house. They had shaped the realm's laws and its learning. To let that influence slip away, to let a rival faction take the throne and diminish their standing, was unthinkable. Ormund understood that the Green cause was not just about Aegon II, it was about the continued relevance of his own house. So Ormund began to mobilize. He called his banners, gathered his resources, and prepared to march. The Reach was a vast and fertile land, filled with powerful houses, and not all of them would side with the Greens. The Tyrells, the nominal lords of the Reach, were cautious and stayed out of the war for as long as they could. But Ormund did not need their permission. He had the men, the gold and the will to act on his own. He raised a host that would number around 15,000 soldiers, the largest standing force left in the realm at that stage of the conflict. It was a statement of intent. The Hightowers were not just supporting the king, they were becoming the king's sword in the south, and Ormund himself would lead that sword. He was not a man to command from a safe distance. He would take the field with his Valyrian steel blade, Vigilance at his side, and he would fight for his family, for his house, and for the crown he had helped to place. The succession crisis had torn the realm in two, and Ormund Hightower had chosen his side. There would be no turning back. Now the war would move beyond declarations and coronations. The armies would march, the dragons would fly, and the battles would be fought in the fields and rivers of the Reach. Ormund's path would lead him to places like the Honeywine, and later to the town of Tumbleton, where the fate of the Green cause would hang in the balance. But before any of that, there was the slow, deliberate work of war, the gathering of supplies, the drilling of soldiers, the sending of ravens. Ormund was a man who understood that preparation was as important as action, and he would not be caught unprepared. The Hightower host was stirring, and the Reach would soon feel the weight of its march. When the realms split in two, the question was never simply which side had the better claim. It was which side could sustain itself long enough to make that claim stick. A crown without a treasury is just a piece of metal. A king without food for his armies is a man giving speeches to ghosts. And in the opening moves of the Dance of the Dragons, the Greens understood something that their opponents would learn only through fire and starvation. That the war would not be won by the dragon that breathed the hottest flame, but by the faction that could still feed its soldiers after a year of marching. This is why the Greens needed Oldtown, not as a symbol, not as peace on a board, but as the engine that kept the entire Green war machine breathing. When we measure what the Green cause gained from Hightower support, we are not counting banners or titles. We are counting silver, wheat, timber, and hulls. We are counting the difference between an army that can campaign and an army that collapses before it ever reaches the battlefield. Oldtown was the richest city in Westeros, and that wealth was not idle. The Hightowers controlled the largest fleet in the Reach, a navy built not for glory, but for the steady, unglamorous work of moving cargo. Grain from the fertile lands around the Honeywine, timber from the forests of the northern Reach, iron from the mines that dotted the foothills. All of it flowed through Oldtown's harbour, and when the war began, that flow did not stop. It was redirected, with purpose and precision, straight into the Green War effort. Money, of course, was the most obvious contribution. Gold buys swords, but more importantly, it buys the time to forge them. It buys the smiths who make the arrowheads, the tanners who cure the leather for saddles and scabbards, the carpenters who build the siege towers and the trebuchets. A lord who pays his soldiers on time keeps them loyal. A lord who pays his suppliers keeps his supply lines open. And Ormund Hightower, as the head of his house, had access to a treasury that could outlast most of the noble families of Westeros combined. But money alone does not feed an army. Armies march on their stomachs, and the Greens' armies were vast. The Reach was the breadbasket of the Seven Kingdoms, and Oldtown sat at the heart of that abundance. The grain silos of the Hightower were legendary, capable of holding enough wheat to feed the city through a siege of several years. In wartime, that grain became the backbone of the Green supply chain. Every sack of flour that reached a Green camp, every loaf of bread that kept a soldier standing through a long night watch, came from fields that the Hightowers controlled or protected. Ships were another matter entirely. The Greens needed to move men and supplies along the coasts, to reinforce positions, to blockade enemy harbours, to carry messages faster than a rider could gallop. The Hightower fleet gave them that mobility. It was not the largest navy in Westeros. The Iron Fleet and the Redwine Fleet both outnumbered it, but it was the most strategically placed. Oldtown sat at the mouth of the Honeywine, with access to the Sunset Sea and the waters around the southern coast. From that harbour, ships could reach the Arbor, the Shield Islands, the coast of the Stormlands, and even the Gullet with favourable winds. The Greens did not need to win every naval battle. They needed to control the sea lanes that kept their armies alive, and Oldtown gave them that control. Men, of course, were the final and most visible contribution. The Hightower host was not the largest army in the Reach, but it was the best equipped and the most reliably loyal. Ormund could call upon thousands of soldiers from the city itself, and from the Hightower lands, stretching along the coast and inland. These were not raw levies pulled from the fields with pitchforks. They were men trained in the traditions of a city that had stood for thousands of years. Soldiers who knew how to hold a shield wall, how to march in formation, how to endure the boredom and terror of a long campaign, and they were led by a man who understood that war was not a series of heroic charges, but a grinding, patient process of attrition. This is where the contrast between dragon power and logistics becomes most important. Dragons are terrifying. They can burn armies, melt castles, turn a battlefield into a charnel house in minutes. But dragons cannot hold ground. They cannot garrison a town. They cannot patrol a supply line through the night. They cannot ensure that the grain reaches the camp before the men start eating their horses. A dragon is a weapon of shock and awe, but war is not won by shock and awe alone. It is won by the slow, unglamorous work of keeping your army fed, armed and paid, while your enemy's army starves, deserts, or mutinies. The Greens understood this because they had to. They did not have the numerical advantage in dragons that the Blacks enjoyed early in the war. Rhaenyra's faction claimed more adult dragons, more experienced riders, more raw destructive potential. The Greens had Vagar, the largest dragon in the world, and Sunfire and a few others, but they could not match the Blacks' dragon for dragon. What they could match and surpass was the ability to sustain a prolonged war, and that ability rested squarely on the shoulders of Oldtown. Armies cannot march without food. They cannot eat without grain. They cannot replace losses without gold to hire new soldiers or buy new equipment. A wealthy ally is not a luxury in a civil war. It is a necessity. The Greens could afford to lose battles, as long as they could afford to fight again. The Blacks, for all their dragons, could not afford to lose their supply lines, and the Hightowers controlled the richest, most secure supply line in the Seven Kingdoms. When royal authority began to fracture, when the Crown's ability to command loyalty and collect taxes started to crumble under the weight of war, Ormund Hightower became the Green Southern Foundation. He was not merely a bannerman doing his duty. He was the pillar that held up the entire Green strategy in the Reach and beyond. While other lords wavered, while some changed sides or sat out the war entirely, Ormund remained steady. He did not need the Crown's authority to raise men or collect taxes. He had his own authority, rooted in the ancient power of Oldtown, a city that had existed before the Targaryens ever set foot on Dragonstone. This is the kind of power that does not need to be announced. It does not need to be displayed in grand gestures or dramatic speeches. It simply exists, quietly, patiently waiting to be used, and Ormund Hightower knew how to use it. He was not a man who sought glory. He sought victory, and he understood that victory came from the slow accumulation of advantages, from the careful management of resources, from the willingness to outlast your enemy rather than outfight them. So when we ask why the Greens needed Oldtown, the answer is not complicated. They needed it because without it, they would have been a faction of dragons and little else. They would have had the power to destroy, but not the power to build. They would have had the ability to burn, but not the ability to hold. Oldtown gave them the weight to make their cause more than a fleeting flame. It gave them the weight to endure. And as the war ground on, as the bodies piled up and the fields turned to ash, that endurance would prove to be the most valuable asset of all. The dragons would fight, and they would die, but the grain would keep coming, the ships would keep sailing, the gold would keep flowing, and Ormund Hightower would be there, watching, calculating, waiting for the moment when patience finally paid its dividend. The Reach, for all its green fields and ancient keeps, was never a single voice. It was a chorus of competing ambitions, and when the dance of the dragons began, that chorus became a battlefield of loyalties. Oldtown commanded the largest army in the realm, but commanding an army and commanding the Reach were two very different things. Ormund Hightower understood this better than most. He knew that the power of the Hightower host was not just in its numbers, but in the fragile web of alliances that held it together. The Lords of the Reach had been feuding for generations. The Tyrells, as Wardens of the South, held nominal authority over the region, but their power was always more ceremonial than real. Beneath them, houses like the Florents, the Oakhearts, And the Rowans had their own histories, their own grievances, and their own ambitions. When King Viserys died and the realm split, these old rivalries did not vanish. They sharpened. Every Hightower decision, every march, every supply line had to account for the fact that a neighbouring lord might be watching for weakness, waiting for a chance to settle an old score. Ormund's first challenge was not a battle against Rhaenyra's forces. It was a battle for the loyalty of his own bannermen. Some houses declared for the Greens immediately, bound by marriage or debt or ancient fealty to Oldtown, but others hesitated. The Tarlis, the Hightower's neighbours, and eventual kin through Ormund's marriage to Samantha Tarly, were reliable, but the Rowans of Golden Grove had long resented Hightower influence. The Florents, who had their own claims to the Reach through a distant Targaryen marriage, saw an opportunity, and the Oakharts, proud and independent, were not easily swayed by letters from the Hightower. The danger was not just that these houses might stay neutral. The danger was that they might actively oppose Oldtown. In a war where every soldier counted, a hostile banner in your rear could be as deadly as an enemy army in front of you. Ormund had to consider that some of his most difficult battles would be fought not on the open field, but in the halls of keeps he had never visited, among lords he had never met. He began with diplomacy. Letters were sent, promises made, marriages proposed, but words could only do so much. When a house refused to bend, Ormund had to decide whether to march against them, risking time and men, or leave them be, risking a dagger in his back. It was a calculus that would define his entire campaign. He could not afford to leave enemies behind him, but he could not afford to waste his strength on sieges either. The Reach, in those early months of the war, was a patchwork of loyalties. Some lords declared for Rhaenyra, seeing the Hightowers as usurpers and the Greens as a threat to the realm's stability. Others declared for Aegon, bound by tradition or fear or the promise of reward, and many simply waited, watching to see which way the wind would blow. Ormund knew that patience was a weapon, but it was also a risk. Every day he delayed, Rhaenyra's supporters grew bolder, and the cracks in his own coalition widened. He had to conquer allies as much as he had to defeat enemies. That meant winning over the hesitant, intimidating the hostile, and rewarding the loyal. It meant knowing when to offer a hand and when to show a blade. The Hightower host was the largest standing force in the realm, but it was not invincible. Its strength depended on the unity of its commanders, and unity was a fragile thing in a land where old wounds never fully healed. Ormund's reputation as a scholar and a strategist served him well in these negotiations. He could speak to lords in their own languages, appealing to their pride, their fears, and their ambitions. He could present himself not as a conqueror, but as a leader who understood the weight of their decisions. But beneath that calm exterior, he was always calculating, always planning, always waiting for the moment when a rival would reveal their hand. The houses that rejected Oldtown's leadership were not just obstacles, they were lessons. Each refusal taught Ormund something about the Reach's political landscape, about the alliances that held and the ones that frayed. He learned which lords could be trusted and which could not. He learned that loyalty was often a matter of convenience, and that convenience could change with the wind. By the time Ormund marched his host out of Oldtown, he had secured the allegiance of most of the Reach's major houses, but he had also left behind a trail of broken promises, simmering resentments, and quiet threats. The Reach was not a unified kingdom marching to war. It was a collection of rival houses, each with its own agenda, held together by the sheer force of Ormund Hightower's will, and that force would be tested again and again in the battles to come. The Honeywine, the marches through the Riverlands, the siege of Tumbleton. Each campaign would reveal new fractures in the Hightower coalition. Ormund would have to mend them, or watch his army crumble from within. The Reach refused to obey, and that refusal would shape every decision he made, every battle he fought, every life he sacrificed. But for now, the host was moving. The banners of the Hightower, the Tarlis, The beastberries and the fossaways flew together. The roads were filled with men and horses and wagons of supplies. And at the head of it all, Ormund Hightower rode, his Valyrian steel sword Vigilance at his side, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew that the war ahead would be fought not just against dragons and armies, but against the very nature of the land he called home. The Reach was a garden of thorns, and he was the gardener who would have to prune it with fire and steel. The Reach, as we have seen, was never a single voice. Its lords were too old, too proud, too tangled in debts and grudges to march as one. And yet, from the chaos of those divided banners, one figure began to emerge as the clear, unyielding centre of gravity for the green cause in the south. That figure was Ormund Hightower, Lord of Oldtown, and he was about to step fully into a role that had been waiting for him since the moment Aegon II was crowned. We follow Ormund now as he assumes direct command of the Hightower war effort. This was not a sudden, dramatic appointment. It was the culmination of weeks of quiet preparation, of letters sent and received, of stores counted and ledgers balanced. Ormund had always been a lord who preferred the study to the battlefield, but he understood that the time for study was over. The realm was at war, and Oldtown, his city, his birthright, could not afford to stand idle. So he set aside his histories and his tapestries, and he took up the burden of command. The force that began to gather beneath his banners was not merely an army. It was an expression of civic power, a living demonstration of what Oldtown truly meant. Knights came from the streets of the city itself, their armour polished and their horses well fed, bearing the sigils of ancient families that had served the Hightowers for generations. Levies arrived from the surrounding countryside, farmers and craftsmen who had been called to duty, their faces a mixture of pride and apprehension, and behind them came the slow, steady river of supplies. Wagons of grain, barrels of salted meat, casks of water and wine, bolts of cloth for tents and bandages, and the endless grinding weight of coin. Ormund oversaw it all. He did not shout or gesture grandly. He stood in the courtyard of the Hightower, watching as the columns formed, as the captains reported, as the smiths sharpened swords and the fletchers bundled arrows. He spoke in low, measured tones to his commanders, asking questions that revealed how deeply he understood the mechanics of war. How many days of rations? How many spare horseshoes? What was the condition of the roads toward Bitterbridge? He was not a man who needed to be seen leading from the front. He was a man who needed to know that every detail was accounted for, because he knew that in a war of this scale, it was the details that would decide the outcome, and the scale was immense. By the time the last of the host had assembled, Ormund Hightower commanded a force that may have been the greatest conventional army still intact in the realm. The numbers are difficult to pin down precisely, but the most reliable accounts place his strength at around 15,000 men. That is a staggering figure when you consider the losses. The Greens and the Blacks had already suffered. Dragonfire had turned castles to ash and armies to cinders. The Riverlands had been bled dry. The Crownlands were a patchwork of burned fields and abandoned villages. But here in the fertile lands of the Reach, a host of 15,000 men stood ready, armed, fed and paid. This army was not just a collection of bodies, it was a statement. It said that Oldtown was not merely a source of wealth and wisdom, but a source of raw, unyielding military power. It said that the Hightowers could field a host that rivaled anything the Targaryens had ever commanded without dragons. And it said that Ormund Hightower, the scholar, the collector of histories, the man who had seemed content to rule from his tower, was now the Lord Commander of that host. The commanders who served under him were a reflection of the Reach itself. There were seasoned knights who had fought in the stepstones, young lords eager to prove themselves, and veteran captains who had spent their lives guarding the borders of the Hightower domains. Ormund did not surround himself with sycophants. He chose men who knew their trade, who could be trusted to carry out orders without hesitation. And he made sure that they understood one thing above all else. This army was not a mob, it was a machine, and every part of it had to work in harmony. Coin flowed freely, but it was accounted for with meticulous care. Ormund knew that an unpaid army was a mutinous army, and a mutinous army was worse than no army at all. He had the resources of Oldtown behind him, and he used them without waste. Every gold dragon was spent with purpose. Every sack of grain was tracked. Every horse was shod and fed. It was not glamorous work, but it was the work that won wars. And as the host began its slow march northward, Ormund Hightower rode at its head. He carried no banner but his own, the white tower of House Hightower, blazing against a field of smoke grey. At his side hung Vigilance, the Valyrian steel sword that had been in his family for centuries, a blade that had seen more history than most men could imagine. He did not draw it. He did not need to. Its presence was enough. It was a reminder that he was not just a commander. He was a lord of Oldtown, and Oldtown did not bend. The army moved like a living thing, its columns stretching for miles along the roads of the Reach. The dust of its passage rose into the sky, visible from leagues away. Farmers stopped their work to watch, and children ran to the edges of the fields to see the knights and the footmen and the wagons pass. It was a sight that had not been seen in the Reach for generations, and it would not be seen again for many more. Ormund did not look back. He had left Oldtown in the hands of his castellan, his sons scattered to their duties, his wife, Samantha, managing the affairs of the household in his absence. The city would endure. It had endured for thousands of years, and it would endure this war. But Ormund knew that the war would not be won by staying within its walls. It would be won on the march, on the field, in the mud, and the blood and the long grinding days of a campaign that would test every man under his command. And so the Lord Commander of Oldtown led his host forward into a realm that was burning. The roads ahead were uncertain, the loyalties of the Reach still divided, and the shadow of dragon wings stretched across the sky. But Ormund Hightower had made his choice. He had committed his city, his family, and his army to the cause of Aegon II, and he would see that cause through, no matter the cost. The army would find its first test soon enough, in the fields and rivers and valleys that lay between Oldtown and the heart of the war. But that is a story for another telling. For now, the host marches, and the Lord Commander rides at its head, and the fate of the Reach rests on his shoulders. The previous chapter left us at the edge of Oldtown, watching Ormund Hightower assume direct command of his war effort. The force gathering beneath his banners was already vast, but now we must understand its true size and what that size means. The numbers reported in the histories are staggering, and they demand our attention. 15,000 men. That is the figure most often attached to Ormund Hightower's Reach host when it finally marched. 15,000 soldiers, knights, archers, and men-at-arms, all under a single commander. To put that number in perspective, consider that the largest armies in Westerosi history rarely exceeded 40 or 50,000 at their peak, and those were gathered from entire kingdoms, not a single region. 15,000 is not merely a large force, it is a force that can decide the fate of a war. But why does a number alone carry such weight? Because in the Game of Thrones, perception is reality. When word spreads that Ormund Hightower commands 15,000 men, every lord in the Reach must calculate his position anew. A lord who might have considered declaring for Rhaenyra now faces a stark choice. He can join the Hightower host and share in its potential victory, or he can oppose it and risk annihilation. The number itself becomes a weapon, wielded before a single sword is drawn. It alters negotiations because it shifts the balance of power. It changes loyalties because it makes resistance seem futile. It reshapes enemy plans because commanders must account for a threat that large, that organised, and that close to the heart of the conflict. Yet numbers alone do not make an army. 15,000 men must be fed, moved and controlled, and that is where Ormund's true genius reveals itself. Feeding 15,000 mouths requires an endless supply of grain, meat and water. Every day, that host consumes the equivalent of a small town's entire weekly provisions. Moving them requires roads, bridges, and a steady flow of horses, wagons, and draft animals. Controlling them demands discipline, communication, and a chain of command that can relay orders across miles of marching columns. Ormund did not simply gather men. He built a system that could sustain them, a logistical machine that turned Oldtown's wealth into military pressure. Oldtown itself was the key. As the richest city in the Reach, it had the granaries, the warehouses, and the coin to purchase supplies from every corner of the region. Ormund's agents scoured the countryside for food, for fodder, for leather and iron and wool. They hired carters and smiths and farriers. They commandeered ships to move goods up the Honeywine and along the coast. Every resource of Oldtown was transformed into a tool of war, and Ormund was the hand that directed it all. This is why he is so dangerous. Not because he wields a Valyrian steel sword, though Vigilance is a symbol of his house's ancient power. Not because he is related to the Queen or the Hand, though those connections give him political cover. His true talent is the ability to turn infrastructure into influence, to convert the mundane work of supply and organization into a weapon that presses against the enemy without ever being swung. 15,000 men are a reason to fear him, but the real fear comes from knowing that every one of those men is fed, armed, and ready to march at his command. And as that host begins to move, as the columns of soldiers and wagons stretch across the roads of the Reach, the question that hangs over everything is what happens when such a force meets the enemy. The answer will come soon enough, in the fields and rivers and towns where Ormund's strategy will be tested. But for now, the host is gathering and the realm is watching, and so the question of leadership becomes paramount. Ormund Hightower is not merely a logistician, though that skill is rare enough in any age. He is also a commander who understands the psychology of war. He knows that an army's morale is as vital as its rations. To that end, he has surrounded himself with knights of proven loyalty, men whose names carry weight in the Reach. Sir Brynden Hightower, his cousin, a seasoned warrior with a reputation for steadiness in the line. Lord Costain of the Three Towers, whose fleet can harass enemy coasts. And perhaps most tellingly, he has secured the allegiance of House Beesbury, whose master, Lord Lyman, sits on the King's small council. That allegiance was not given freely. It was won through careful negotiation, through promises of land and title, through the subtle pressure of a host that could destroy any house that refused. This is the art of coalition building, and Ormund is a master of it. But there is another layer, one that speaks to the deeper currents of the Dance of the Dragons. For every lord who marches with Ormund, there is a lord who stays behind, nursing grievances or waiting for a better offer. The Reach is not a monolith. It is a patchwork of ancient rivalries and fresh ambitions. House Tyrell, the nominal wardens of the South, remain neutral, their power too fragile to risk in open war. That neutrality is a gift to Ormund, for it means he can act without interference from Highgarden. But it is also a warning, for it means that the Hightower ascendancy is not universally accepted. There are houses like the Tarlis, the Rowans, and the Oakhearts, who watch from the shadows, their swords still sheathed, their loyalties unspoken. Ormund must march before those shadows decide to strike, and so the host begins its slow, deliberate movement northward. The vanguard is composed of heavy cavalry, knights in gleaming plate, their banners snapping in the wind. Behind them come the foot soldiers, a sea of spears and shields, their boots kicking up dust that hangs in the air like a shroud. Then the wagons, creaking under loads of grain, arrows and spare weapons. And finally, the rear guard, a force of archers and scouts to protect against ambush. The column stretches for miles, a living serpent of steel and flesh, and at its head rides Ormund Hightower, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the war awaits. But even as he marches, the realm is already reacting. In King's Landing, Queen Alicent hears the reports with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Her father, Lord Otto Hightower, the Hand of the King, knows that his brother's success is his own. In Dragonstone, Rhaenyra Targaryen receives word of the advancing host, and she begins to summon her own allies. The blacks and the greens are now locked in a dance that will end only when one site is destroyed. And at the centre of that dance stands Ormund Hightower, his 15,000 men, and the terrible weight of a war that will decide the fate of a dynasty. 15,000 men. That is the number we ended with in the last chapter. And it is a number that carries weight in a kingdom tearing itself apart. But a number on a page is not an army on the march. 15,000 men do not simply rise from their beds one morning and walk as one toward the enemy. They must be gathered, equipped, fed, and directed. They must be told where to go, and when and why. And for a commander like Ormund Hightower, the slow work of turning that number into a weapon is where his true genius reveals itself. The mustering of the Hightower host did not happen overnight. It began in the days after the Green Council in King's Landing, when ravens flew from the Hightower to every corner of the Reach. Ormund sent riders to every house that owed fealty to Oldtown. Every lord who had sworn an oath to the Hightower banner, and those lords in turn sent their own riders to their own bannermen. A chain of command stretching across the fertile plains and rolling hills of the Reach, each link forged by duty or by fear. It took weeks for the first companies to arrive at the appointed gathering grounds, and months before the full host was ready to move. But Ormund was not idle during that time. While his men assembled, he studied the reports that came in from every direction. Scouts on fast horses, traders with sharp eyes, and even the occasional maester's raven brought him news of the world beyond his borders. He learned which lords had declared for Rhaenyra and which still sat on the fence. He learned where the black forces were gathering and where the roads were safe. He learned which bridges had been burned and which rivers were running high. Every piece of information was a piece of a puzzle, and Ormund was determined to solve it before he committed his army to the field. This is the kind of war that Ormund Hightower understood, not the sudden terrible violence of dragonfire, where a single beast could turn a castle to ash in an afternoon. That kind of war was happening elsewhere, in the skies above the Riverlands and the Stormlands, where Targaryen fought Targaryen, and the ground below paid the price. But Ormund's war was slower, more deliberate, and in its own way, just as deadly. He knew that a lord who arrives late may still arrive with the decisive army, if he arrives at the right moment. And he knew that every day of delay was a day of new information, a day to adjust his plans, a day to let his enemies make mistakes. The supply lines alone were a feat of organization that would have broken a lesser commander. 15,000 men need food, water, fodder for horses, arrows for bows, spare blades for broken swords, and 100 other things that are easy to forget when you are only counting soldiers. Ormund had to ensure that grain wagons rolled on schedule, that butchers and bakers followed the column, that smiths had the materials to repair armor and shoe horses. He had to think about the weather, about the condition of the roads, about the loyalty of the villages his army would pass through. A single broken axle on a supply cart could delay an entire column, and a delay could mean the difference between arriving in time for a battle or arriving to find your allies already dead. And so the Hightower host moved slowly, not because Ormund was indecisive, but because he was thorough. He sent scouts ahead in pairs, and then in groups, riding far beyond the main column, to watch for ambushes and to map the terrain. He kept his cavalry close, not as a striking force but as a screen, so that no enemy rider could get close enough to count his numbers. He marched his men in disciplined columns, with officers at every level to maintain order and to pass commands down the chain. It was not a dramatic march, not the kind of thing that bards would sing about. It was a slow grinding advance, a machine of war that moved at the pace of a plough horse. But that was exactly the point. Ormund was not trying to impress anyone. He was trying to win a war, and winning a war, as he understood it, was not about glory or about proving who was braver. It was about putting your army in the right place, at the right time, with enough supplies to fight and enough information to make good decisions. It was about making your enemy react to you, rather than the other way around, and it was about being patient enough to wait for the moment when your patience would pay off. While Ormund marched, the world around him burned. Dragons fought in the skies above the God's Eye, and armies clashed at places like Rook's Rest and the Gullet. The war was moving fast in some places, faster than anyone could have predicted, but in the Reach, the war was moving at Ormund's pace. He was not going to be rushed into a mistake by the urgency of others. He was not going to throw away his army in a foolish charge or a poorly planned assault. He was going to march until he found the enemy, and then he was going to fight on his own terms. The slow march to war was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strength. It was the strength of a commander who knew that the hardest part of a campaign is not the battle itself, but everything that comes before it. It was the strength of a lord who understood that an army is not a mob, but a tool, and that a tool must be sharpened and maintained before it can be used. And it was the strength of a man who had spent his life studying the art of war, not in the field, but in the libraries of Oldtown, where the histories of 1,000 campaigns were written down for those who had the patience to read them. So Ormund Hightower marched, slowly, carefully, with scouts ahead and supply trains behind, with officers at every rank and a plan for every contingency. He marched because that was what the Green cause needed from him. He marched because the war would not wait forever. And he marched because, in the end, a lord who arrives late may still arrive with the decisive army. The question was not whether he would arrive, but when, and what he would find when he got there. The answer to that question would come soon enough, in the fields and rivers of the Reach, where the Hightower host would finally meet the enemy. But that is a story for another time. For now, the army is still moving, the scouts are still riding, and Ormund Hightower is still thinking 3 moves ahead, as he always has. The slow march to war continues, and every step brings him closer to the moment when patience will no longer be a virtue, but a weapon. The slow march had been a test of patience, of supply lines, of the 1,000 small decisions that keep an army alive before it ever sees an enemy. Ormund Hightower understood this better than most. He had spent months gathering his strength, watching the Reach churn with divided loyalties, waiting for the moment when his 15,000 men would be more than a number on a parchment. That moment was arriving now, not with a single dramatic clash, but with a question of geography. Where would his army go? And more importantly, what ground would they have to take to get there? The answer begins with a river, the Honeywine. It is not the longest river in the Reach, nor the widest, but its importance to the Hightower cause is absolute. The Honeywine flows south from the highlands, past the walls of Oldtown itself, and empties into the Sunset Sea. For centuries, it has been the lifeblood of the region, carrying trade, food, and news from the interior down to the great port city. But in war, a river is never just a river. It is a barrier, a highway, a line of supply, and a potential grave. To understand the Honeywine Front, you have to look at the land around it. Oldtown sits at the mouth of the river, protected by its walls, its fleet, and the starry sept. But the city is not the whole of Hightower power. The lands that feed Oldtown, that send its grain and its levies, stretch north and east along the Honeywine's tributaries. These are not empty fields. They are dotted with villages, holdfasts, and the seats of lesser houses who owe allegiance to the Hightower. And every one of those settlements is a potential target for an enemy who wants to starve Oldtown into submission. The river itself is navigable for much of its length, which means that control of the Honeywine is control of movement. An army that holds the crossings can move men and supplies faster than an army that must march overland through muddy fields and narrow roads. But the crossings are few. Bridges are rare in the Reach, and the fords are seasonal, dependent on rain and snowmelt. A clever commander knows that the battle for the Honeywine will not be fought on a single field. It will be fought at a dozen small points, each one a choke point where a few determined men can hold up a host. This is the reality that Ormund Hightower faces as he prepares to secure his own backyard. The Reach is not a single kingdom united under a single will. It is a patchwork of proud houses, old grudges, and shifting allegiances. Some of those houses have already declared for Rhaenyra. Others are waiting to see which way the wind blows. And still others are watching the Hightower host with the cold calculation of men who know that the winner of this war will be the one who controls the roads, the rivers, and the granaries. The Honeywine Front, then, is not just a military problem, it is a political test. Can the Hightowers hold the lands that have been theirs for generations? Can they keep the roads open, the river secure, and the small folk loyal? If they cannot, then the grand army that Ormund has assembled will be nothing more than a target, trapped in a hostile countryside with no way to move and no way to feed itself. But Ormund is not the kind of lord who leaves such things to chance. He has spent his life studying maps, reading histories, and learning the lessons of past campaigns. He knows that the road to larger victories begins with control of smaller ground. Before he can march on Tumbleton, before he can challenge the Blacks in the heart of the Reach, he must first prove that he can hold the land around his own city. He must show that the Hightower name still commands respect, that the banners of Oldtown still mean something when they fly over a battlefield. And so the slow march continues, but now it has a direction. The scouts fan out, the foragers move ahead, and the column of men and horses and wagons begins to follow the course of the Honeywine. They are not looking for a single decisive battle. They are looking for the weak points in the enemy's grip, the crossings that must be secured, the villages that must be held. Every mile gained is a mile denied to the enemy. Every ford that is guarded is a door that stays closed. This is the kind of war that Ormund Hightower was made for, not the sudden terror of dragonfire, but the slow, grinding work of securing ground, building supply lines, and turning geography into a weapon. The Honeywine will test him. It will test his patience, his judgment, and his ability to see the battlefield not as a single point, but as a web of connections. And if he passes that test, the road north will open. If he fails, the river will become his grave. But for now, the army moves, the river flows, and the Reach waits to see which lord will prove worthy of the ground beneath his feet. The Honeywine Front was a problem of rivers and roads, of supply lines and slow-moving columns. Ormund Hightower understood that kind of war. He had spent months gathering his strength, building his 15,000-man host, watching the land and the weather and the loyalties of every minor lord who rode beneath his banners. He knew the Reach the way a shipwright knows the grain of oak. He knew which fords would flood in spring, which villages could feed an army, which keeps would open their gates, and which would need to be starved into submission. That was his war. It was patient, it was deliberate. It was a war fought with maps and quartermasters, and the slow, grinding pressure of superior numbers. But war in the Age of Dragons does not always wait for the infantry, and that is where the prince enters the story. Daeron Targaryen, the youngest son of King Viserys and Queen Alicent, a boy raised in Oldtown, far from the intrigue of King's Landing, far from the shadow of his brother Aegon and his sister Rhaenyra. He had been sent to the Hightower as a ward after the death of his father, and there he had grown into a young man of quiet composure, scholarly instincts, and a deep bond with his dragon, Tessarion, the Blue Queen, a dragon of cobalt and copper, smaller than Vagar or Vermithor, but swift and fierce and loyal beyond measure. For years, Daeron had been a figure on the margins of the great game. He was the prince who studied in Oldtown, who learned the histories and the laws, who trained with a sword but never drew it in anger. He was not a player in the Dance of the Dragons. Not yet. But when the war began, when the Greens moved to secure the realm, Daeron and Tessarion became something that Ormund Hightower could never be. They became the terror from above. This is the moment where the Hightower campaign changes. Not because Ormund abandons his strategy, but because he gains a weapon that no amount of infantry or supply wagons can replicate. A dragon is not a siege engine. A dragon is not a cavalry charge. A dragon is a force of nature that can reduce a castle to rubble in an afternoon, that can scatter an army before the first arrow is loosed, that can turn a battlefield into a funeral pyre before the enemy even sees the smoke. Ormund understood this. He was too shrewd not to. He had spent his life studying war, collecting histories, reading the accounts of Aegon's conquest and the campaigns of the Old King. He knew what dragons could do, but he also knew what dragons could not do. They could not hold ground. They could not garrison a town. They could not feed an army, or guard a supply line, or negotiate a surrender. A dragon wins battles. An army wins wars. And Ormund Hightower intended to win the war. So the partnership that formed between the Lord of Oldtown and the Prince of the Blue Queen was not a matter of friendship or shared ideals. It was a matter of function. Ormund commanded the earth. He controlled the roads, the rivers, the granaries, the forges, the men who marched and fought and died in the mud. Daron commanded the sky. He brought the fire, the speed, the shock, the terror that no army could withstand. Together, they formed a complete instrument of war. One could not move without the other. One could not succeed without the other. This is the green strategy taking shape, not through a single grand plan, but through the union of royal blood and Oldtown discipline. The Hightowers had always been the power behind the throne in King's Landing. Otto Hightower had served as Hand of the King. Alicent Hightower had sat beside the Iron Throne. But in the Reach, the Hightowers were not the power behind anything. They were the power itself. And now that power had a dragon. Daron's presence changed the calculus of the campaign in ways that Ormund's 15,000 men never could. A host that sighs is a threat. A dragon is a promise. When the Blue Queen appeared over a battlefield, every soldier below knew that the old rules no longer applied. Walls meant nothing. Numbers meant nothing. Courage meant nothing. You could stand and fight, and you would burn. You could run, and you would burn. You could surrender, and perhaps you would live, but only if the prince willed it. That is the terror of dragon warfare. It is absolute, it is final, and it is fast. Ormund's war was slow. He moved his army at the pace of ox carts and marching men. He scouted ahead, secured his flanks, built supply depots, waited for reinforcements. He fought the war the way a Hightower fights, with patience and calculation, and an eye on the long game. But Daron could cover in a single day what the army covered in a week. He could strike a target 100 miles away and be back before the campfires were lit. He could appear without warning, without preamble, without any of the signals that ordinary warfare required. This is why the partnership worked. Ormund provided the structure. Daron provided the shock. Ormund built the cage. Daron closed the door. And the Reach began to feel the weight of that combination. Lords who had wavered in their loyalties suddenly remembered their oaths to the Greens. Castles that had prepared for a siege opened their gates at the sight of Tessarion's wings. Armies that had marched to join the Blacks turned back or scattered, not because they feared Ormund's host, though they had reason to, but because no one wanted to face the Blue Queen. Daron himself was not a cruel prince. By all accounts, he was measured, thoughtful, reluctant to use Tessarion's fire unless it was necessary. He had been raised in Oldtown, surrounded by the Citadel's learning and the Starry Sept's piety. He was not Aemond, who rode Vahagar like a living storm, who seemed to enjoy the destruction he caused. Daron was different. He was a boy who had grown up far from the throne, who had never expected to fight a war, who had been given a dragon and told to use it. But he did use it, because that was his duty, because the Greens needed him, because Ormund Hightower had a plan, and the plan required a prince who could burn. The Green strategy was not just about winning battles. It was about projecting power across the entire realm, about making the cost of resistance so high that no one would dare to pay it. In the Reach, that meant using Ormund's army as the anvil and Daron's dragon as the hammer. It meant showing every lord, every knight, every farmer who looked up at the sky that the Greens controlled the air as surely as they controlled the roads. This was the strategy taking shape, not in a single council chamber, not in a single declaration, but in the movements of armies and the flight of dragons. Ormund Hightower did not need to be the most famous commander in Westeros. He did not need to be the most beloved. He needed to be the most effective. And effectiveness in this war meant combining the old ways with the new. It meant understanding that infantry and supply lines were still the foundation of any campaign, but that dragons were the roof. Without the foundation, the roof collapses. Without the roof, foundation is exposed to the elements. So Ormund marched, slowly, deliberately, with 15,000 men behind him and a prince above him. He watched the rivers and the roads and the loyalties of every lord who crossed his path, and he waited for the moments when the Blue Queen would need to fly, because that was the nature of their partnership. Ormund did not command Daeron, did not control Tessarion. He could not. No one could. But he could create the conditions where Daeron's intervention was decisive. He could put the enemy in a position where they had to stand and fight, where they had no escape, where the only question was whether the prince would come, and the prince always came. This is how the Hightower campaign evolved, from a slow grinding march into something faster, more dangerous, more absolute. The infantry still moved at the pace of ox carts. The supply lines still stretched across the reach. The fords and crossings still had to be secured. But now every enemy commander had to look up. Every decision had to account for the possibility that the sky would turn blue and copper and hot as a forge. Ormund Hightower understood that war is not won by the side with the most dragons. It is won by the side that uses its dragons best. And he intended to use Daeron and Tessarion as precisely as he used his scouts and his quartermasters. The prince was not a weapon to be wasted. He was a resource to be deployed at the exact moment when the enemy had committed their forces, when they could not retreat, when they had no choice but to face the fire. That is the green strategy. That is the union of royal blood and Oldtown discipline. One commands fear from the sky, the other commands the earth, and together they command the war. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The Honeywine. Even the name sounds deceptively gentle, like something you would sip from a goblet on a summer afternoon. But in the year 130 after the conquest, that river became a line drawn in blood and fire. It was the moment the war in the Reach stopped being a matter of mustering and marching, of letters exchanged and lords weighing their options. It became a slaughter, and at the centre of that slaughter, orchestrating every piece of it with the cold precision of a maester dissecting a corpse, stood Ormund Hightower. The previous chapter introduced Daeron Targaryen and his dragon Tessarion, the Blue Queen, and how their arrival changed the calculus of the Hightower host. But a dragon is a weapon, not a commander. A dragon can burn a field, but it cannot decide which field to burn, or when or why. That was Ormund's domain. And as the green host finally made contact with the enemy along the banks of the Honeywine, the full scope of his planning became visible. The clash itself did not begin as a pitched battle. It began as a river crossing contested by scouts and outriders. Ormund had been advancing methodically, his 15,000 men moving in disciplined columns, supply wagons carefully spaced, pickets thrown wide to prevent ambush. He knew the Reach better than any man in his army. He had spent years in Oldtown, studying maps and histories, commissioning tapestries that depicted the great campaigns of ages past. He was not a man given to impulsive decisions. Every mile his army covered had been calculated. Every ford, every hill, every village that could offer shelter or concealment had been noted. The enemy, a coalition of lords loyal to Rhaenyra, had hoped to catch the Hightower host, strung out along the river. They had assembled their own force, smaller but eager, believing that the Greens were overextended and that a swift strike could break Ormund's advance before it ever reached the heart of the Reach. They were wrong. Ormund had anticipated their approach. His scouts had reported their movements 3 days before the first blade was drawn. Instead of rushing to meet them, he slowed his march, allowed his men to rest, and chose the ground himself. He positioned his infantry on a gentle slope overlooking the Honeywine, with the river at his back and his flanks anchored by marshy ground that would bog down any cavalry charge. His archers were placed on the high ground to his left. His heavy horse, the Knights of Oldtown and the Hightower bannermen, were held in reserve behind a low ridge, invisible to the approaching enemy. When the black-aligned lords finally crossed the river, they found Ormund waiting for them, not in a panic, not scrambling to form a line, waiting. The battle unfolded exactly as he had designed it. The first wave of the enemy charge broke against the Hightower shield wall. The second wave faltered as archers rained shafts into their flanks. And then, at the precise moment when the enemy was committed, when their formation had lost its cohesion and their men were struggling in the mud along the riverbank, Ormund released his cavalry. The knights swept around the ridge and struck the enemy flank with devastating force. The line shattered. Men threw down their arms and tried to flee back across the river, but the crossing was choked with bodies and panicked horses. The Honeywine ran red, and then there was Tessarion. Daeron, young and eager, had been held back by Ormund's command. The dragon was not unleashed until the enemy was already broken, but when she came low and fast, her blue flames washing over the survivors who had managed to regroup on the far bank. The terror of dragonfire completed what the infantry and cavalry had begun. By nightfall, the army of the black-aligned Reach's lords had ceased to exist as a fighting force. This was not just a victory, it was a demonstration. Ormund Hightower had taken a coalition of uncertain loyalties, a young prince with a dragon, and a logistical nightmare of supply lines and marching columns, and he had turned them into a single, lethal instrument. The battle itself was brutal, but the message it sent was even sharper. The undecided lords of the Reach had been watching. Many of them had stayed in their castles, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. They had sent polite letters to both sides, offered vague assurances, delayed their commitments. The Dance of the Dragons was a civil war, and civil wars are bad for business. No lord wanted to back the losing side. But after the Honeywine, the calculus shifted. Ormund had not merely won a battle, he had demonstrated that the Greens could project power in the Reach without relying solely on dragons. He had shown that he could organise men, choose ground, time his attacks, and command a host with the kind of competence that wins wars. The lords who had been wavering began to send riders to Oldtown. They offered swords, supplies, gold. They asked for terms. Some of them had been leaning toward Rhaenyra, but the sight of a Hightower army standing victorious over the bodies of their neighbours changed their minds. Fear is a powerful persuader, and Ormund understood that better than most. But the deeper significance of the Honeywine was not just military, it was political, it was symbolic. Before this battle, the Hightowers had been supporters of the Green cause. They had provided money, men, and the strategic anchor of Oldtown. They had been valuable allies. But after the Honeywine, they became something more. They became leaders. Ormund Hightower was no longer just the Lord of Oldtown, a wealthy and powerful bannerman doing his duty to the crown. He was the commander of the largest army in the Reach, the architect of a decisive victory, and the man who had turned a young prince and his dragon into a weapon of political consolidation. The Greens had other commanders, other lords, other armies, but in the Reach, Ormund was the authority. His word carried weight that no royal decree could match, because his word was backed by 15,000 men who had just proven they could win. The Hightowers had always been a house of influence, of wealth, of careful marriages and patient accumulation of power. But the Dance of the Dragons forced them into a different role. They could no longer afford to be the power behind the throne. They had to sit on it, or at least stand beside it with a sword in hand. The Honeywine was the moment that transition became visible to everyone in Westeros. And yet, even in victory, Ormund did not change his nature. He did not celebrate with feasts or tourneys. He did not send boastful ravens to King's Landing. He did what he always did. He planned. He looked at the map. He counted his supplies. He considered his next move. The battle was over, but the war was not. And Ormund Hightower was not the kind of man who rested on his laurels. The river Honeywine would flow clean again in time. The bodies would be burned or buried. The lords who had chosen the losing side would bend the knee or be destroyed. But the shape of the war had changed. The Greens now had a secure southern front, a proven commander, and a host that had tasted victory. The Blacks had lost a significant army, and the hope that the Reach could be turned against Oldtown without a fight. Ormund's gaze turned northward. The road to King's Landing was long, and there were other rivers to cross, other lords to persuade or crush, other battles waiting to be fought. But for now, the Honeywine belonged to the Greens, and the man who had made that happen was already thinking 3 moves ahead. As he always did, victory at the Honeywine had been decisive, but victory is never clean. The river ran red for days afterward, and the bodies of the men who had tried to stop the Hightower advance were buried in shallow graves or left for the crows. Ormund Hightower stood at the centre of that triumph, and in the days that followed, he learned something that every successful commander discovers sooner or later. Success makes you essential, and being essential makes you a target. The Hightower host had grown. What had started as a mustering of perhaps 15,000 men had swollen with each passing week. Lords who had waited to see which way the wind blew now sent their riders to Ormund's camp with offers of swords and spears. Knights who had held back during the uncertain early days now rode in under banners that had not been seen since the start of the war. They came because Ormund had won, and winning attracts men who want a share of the glory. But Ormund was not the kind of lord who mistook enthusiasm for loyalty. He knew that every man who rode into his camp carried his own ambitions beneath his cloak. Some wanted land, some wanted titles, some wanted revenge against old enemies, and they saw Ormund's army as the instrument of that vengeance. And some, perhaps the most dangerous of all, simply wanted to be close to power so they could measure it, test it, and maybe one day take it for themselves. The camp itself became a city of competing ambitions. Tents spread across the meadows for miles, each cluster of pavilions representing a different house, a different lord, a different set of demands. The men of House Hightower occupied the centre, their banners flying high and proud, but around them gathered the contingents of lesser lords, who had pledged their swords to the green cause. And among those lords were men who had once served the other side, men who had bent the knee only after the Honeywine had shown them which way the war was going. Ormund walked among them with the calm, measured stride of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He stopped at campfires to speak with common soldiers. He dined with lords who had brought only a few dozen men, treating them with the same courtesy he showed to the great nobles of the Reach. But his eyes never stopped moving. He watched the way men looked at each other. He listened to the way they spoke about their neighbours, their rivals, their enemies. He was building a map of loyalties and resentments that would be more valuable than any map of roads and rivers. The problem facing every great war leader is victory attracts men who want a share of it. Ormund understood this better than most. He had grown up in Oldtown, where the Game of Thrones was played not with swords, but with marriages, trade agreements, and carefully worded letters. He knew that the men who rode into his camp today might be the same men who would try to undermine him tomorrow. And he knew that the only way to hold an army together was to give each man enough of what he wanted to keep him from reaching for more. So Ormund began to distribute the spoils of victory. He granted lands to loyal knights. He promised marriages to the sons and daughters of houses that had proven their commitment to the green cause. He appointed commanders from among the lords who had fought beside him at the Honeywine, rewarding their courage with authority. But he was careful. He gave nothing that would make any single lord too powerful. He kept the balance, always the balance, because he knew that an army divided by internal rivalries was an army that would shatter at the first real test. Yet even as he worked to hold his host together, Ormund could feel the tension building beneath the surface. The Hightower banners flew above a camp that contained ambitions as varied as the colours of the tents. There were lords who had fought for Rhaenyra before the war began. Lords who had switched sides when they saw the Greens gaining strength. There were knights who had been passed over for promotion. Knights who believed they deserved more than they had received. And there were the young ambitious warriors who had come to the war seeking fame and fortune. Men who looked at Ormund's position and wondered if they could rise as high. Among the most visible of these ambitious figures was a knight named Sir Brynden Hightower, a distant cousin who had arrived at the camp with 100 mounted men and a reputation for boldness that bordered on recklessness. But Brynden had fought well at the Honeywine, leading a charge that had broken the enemy's left flank, and he had expected to be rewarded with a command of his own. Instead, Ormund had given him a position that kept him close but not independent, a subtle message that the Lord of Oldtown did not trust his cousin to act without oversight. Sir Brynden was not the only one who felt slighted. There were lords from the Northern Reach who had brought large contingents and expected to be treated as equals to the Hightowers themselves. There were knights from the Arbor who had sailed up the coast to join the campaign, men who looked down on the inland lords as country bumpkins. And there were the representatives of House Tarly, Ormund's wife's family, who had their own ideas about how the war should be fought and who should lead the charge. Ormund managed these tensions with the same careful hand he used to manage supply lines and troop movements. He held councils where every lord was allowed to speak, even those whose advice he had no intention of following. He made sure that the best supplies went to the men who had fought hardest, not to the men who complained loudest. He promoted men based on merit, but he also promoted men based on need, giving authority to those whose loyalty he needed to secure. But the cost of becoming essential was that Ormund could no longer afford to be wrong. Every decision he made was watched, analysed, and judged by men who were waiting for him to slip. If he failed, they would not simply lose a battle, they would lose the war. And the men who had gathered around his growing power would scatter like leaves in a storm, each one looking for a new master to serve. The Hightower host contained competing ambitions beneath its banners, and Ormund knew that he could not satisfy them all. Some men would always want more than he could give. Some men would always believe that they deserved his position, his authority, his command, and some men would always be watching for the moment when his grip weakened, ready to seize what they could. So Ormund did what he had always done. He planned, he watched, he waited. He sent scouts to map the roads ahead, and he sent spies to map the loyalties of the men around him. He wrote letters to Oldtown, to King's Landing, to every ally who might send reinforcements or supplies. He prepared for the battles that lay ahead, but he also prepared for the battles that might come from within his own camp. And as the sun set over the vast encampment, Ormund stood at the edge of his tent and looked out at the sea of banners. The Hightower Tower rose above them all, black on grey, a symbol of the power that had drawn these men together. But Ormund knew that symbols were not enough. Power had to be held, defended and used, and the men who had gathered around him would only follow as long as he proved worthy of their loyalty. The cost of becoming essential was that Ormund could never rest. Every victory brought new challenges, new rivals, new dangers, but that was the price of command, and Ormund Hightower had been paying it his entire life. He would continue to pay it, because he knew that the alternative was to lose everything he had built. And so the Hightower host marched on, a great machine of war powered by ambition, loyalty, and the cold, calculating will of its commander. The roads ahead were uncertain, the battles yet to come were unknown, But Ormund was ready. He had always been ready. Because in the Game of Thrones, the only thing worse than being essential was being forgotten. Victory at the Honeywine had made Ormund Hightower indispensable. The Reach Lords who had watched his careful advance now saw the results. A shattered enemy host, a secure river crossing, and the young Prince Daeron's dragon Tessarion blooded in battle. But indispensability is a dangerous status in wartime. It attracts allies, yes, but it also attracts scrutiny, envy, and the quiet calculation of men who wonder whether your success serves them or only yourself. Ormund understood this better than most. He had spent his life in Oldtown, surrounded by books and tapestries, and the slow accumulation of knowledge that comes from generations of careful record-keeping. The Hightowers had ruled the city for thousands of years, not through reckless ambition, but through patience, marriage, and the quiet management of information. Ormund was their lord now, and he carried that inheritance in his bones. His reputation among the other Reach Lords was a complicated thing. Some called him secretive, and they meant it as an insult. Others called him cunning, and they meant it as a warning. Both were accurate. Ormund did not share his plans freely. He did not explain his reasoning to men who had no need to know it. When he gave orders, they were precise and final, and he expected them to be obeyed without question. This made him unpopular in some quarters, but it also made him effective. What his critics failed to understand was that secrecy was not a personal failing. It was a tool, and Ormund used it the way a smith uses a hammer, with purpose, with precision, and without apology. In a war where information could mean the difference between life and death, he saw no virtue in transparency. The enemy did not deserve to know his intentions, and neither did allies who might prove unreliable when the fighting turned against them. And Ormund always planned for the possibility that the fighting would turn against him. This was the cold logic at the heart of his method. Survival comes before appearances. A lord who dies gloriously in battle is still dead. His lands pass to his enemies, his family falls into ruin, and his name becomes a footnote in someone else's history. Ormund had no interest in that kind of legacy. He intended to survive, and he intended for House Hightower to survive with him. This meant that surrender, negotiation, and delay were not signs of weakness in his eyes. They were tools, just as legitimate as a sword or a siege engine. A commander who could not retreat was a commander who would eventually be destroyed. A lord who could not negotiate was a lord who would die in a burning castle. Ormund had studied enough history to know that the great houses of Westeros had fallen not because they were defeated in battle, but because they refused to bend when bending was the only sensible option. So he cultivated the ability to appear cooperative while preserving alternate paths to power. When the Greens had called their banners, Ormund had answered without hesitation. He had raised the Hightower host, gathered the bannermen of Oldtown, and marched to war with every appearance of loyal commitment. But he had also kept his own counsel. He had not committed all his forces to the first battle. He had not placed himself in a position where a single defeat could destroy everything. He had built his campaign around the assumption that things might go wrong, and he had prepared accordingly. This was not cowardice. It was the opposite of cowardice. It was the discipline to look at a situation honestly, without the comforting illusions of pride or honour. Ormund knew that the Greens might lose this war. He knew that dragons could die, that armies could be scattered, that kings could fall, and he knew that if the worst happened, House Hightower would still need to exist. Oldtown would still need to be ruled. The Hightower would still need to stand above the Honeywine, as it had for thousands of years. So he built his strategy around contingency. Every decision he made had a backup plan. Every alliance he formed had an exit strategy. Every public statement he made was carefully worded to allow for multiple interpretations. He was not lying exactly. He was simply leaving himself room to maneuver, and he saw no reason to announce that fact to anyone who might use it against him. The men around him noticed. Some of them respected it, others resented it, but none of them could deny that Ormund's approach had produced results. The victory at the Honeywine had been real. The Hightower host was intact, well supplied, and growing stronger by the day. The Prince Daeron had bonded with his dragon and proven himself in combat. The Greens had a secure foothold in the Reach, and Ormund Hightower was the man who had put them there. But success brought new problems. The lords who had gathered around his banner were not all loyal to him personally. Some were ambitious knights looking for glory. Others were rival commanders who saw Ormund's rise as a threat to their own positions. Still others were uncertain allies, men who had joined the Green cause for reasons of convenience rather than conviction. Ormund watched them all, and he kept his own counsel. He knew that the real test of his leadership would not come on the battlefield. It would come in the quiet moments between campaigns, when alliances were tested and loyalties were weighed. It would come when a lord asked for a favour that could not be granted, or when a knight demanded a position that could not be given. It would come when the war took an unexpected turn, and every man in the camp had to decide whether to stand firm or to seek safety elsewhere. Ormund was ready for that test. He had been preparing for it his entire life. He had studied the histories of the Reach, the rise and fall of its great houses, the patterns of betrayal and alliance that had shaped the region for millennia. He knew that power was not a fixed thing. It was a current, flowing and shifting, and the wise lord learned to swim with it rather than against it. So he smiled when he needed to smile. He nodded when he needed to nod. He made promises that he intended to keep, and he made promises that he knew he might have to break. He presented himself as a loyal servant of the Green cause, and in many ways he was. But he also kept his eyes on the horizon, watching for the signs of change that would tell him when it was time to adjust his course. The other lords saw the surface. They saw a commander who was calm, competent, and unfailingly polite. They saw a man who listened to advice without revealing his own thoughts. They saw a lord who could be trusted to do what he said he would do, as long as what he said served his own purposes. What they did not see was the network of informants and agents that Ormund maintained across the Reach. They did not know about the letters he exchanged with lords who had not yet declared for either side. They did not understand that every conversation, every negotiation, every apparent concession was part of a larger pattern, a design that only Ormund himself could see. This was the cold logic of his method. He did not need to be loved. He did not need to be admired. He needed to be effective, and effectiveness in wartime meant controlling the flow of information, managing expectations, and keeping as many options open as possible. If that meant appearing weak in order to preserve strength, he would do it. If it meant negotiating with enemies while pretending to be inflexible, he would do that too. The key was to never let anyone see the full picture. Ormund understood that his power depended on the perception of his allies and enemies alike. If they believed he was committed to a single course of action, they would plan accordingly. If they believed he was unpredictable, they would hesitate. And hesitation in war was often the difference between victory and defeat. So he cultivated an air of mystery. He spoke in measured tones, choosing his words with care. He revealed nothing that he did not intend to reveal, and he listened far more than he spoke. When he gave orders, they were clear and decisive, but they never explained the reasoning behind them. His captains learned to obey without understanding, and that was exactly how Ormund wanted it. The Prince Daeron, young and eager, sometimes pressed for more information. He wanted to understand the strategy, to see the larger design that Ormund was building. But Ormund deflected these questions with patient courtesy, explaining only what was necessary for the prince to fulfill his role. Daeron was a weapon, a magnificent and terrible weapon, and Ormund intended to use him carefully, but he did not intend to share command. This caused some tension, but Ormund accepted that as the price of effectiveness. He could not afford to let sentiment or personal relationships interfere with his planning. The war was too important, and the stakes were too high. If Darren was offended by his secrecy, that was unfortunate, but it was also unavoidable. And so Ormund continued to build his campaign, layer by layer, contingency by contingency. He fortified his supply lines, secured his communications, and cultivated his network of informants. He made himself essential to the Green cause. But he did so in a way that preserved his independence. If the war turned against them, he would be in a position to negotiate, to retreat, to survive. The other lords might call him a schemer. They might whisper about his secretiveness, his coldness, his refusal to commit fully to the cause. But Ormund did not care about their whispers. He cared about results, and the results so far spoke for themselves. He was the Lord of Oldtown, the master of the Hightower, the commander of the largest army still in the field. He had won a victory at the Honeywine, secured the loyalty of a dragon prince, and positioned himself as one of the most powerful men in the Seven Kingdoms. And he had done it all while keeping his true intentions hidden, preserving his options, and planning for every possible future. That was the kind of lord he was, a lord who planned for defeat even as he pursued victory, a lord who understood that survival was the only victory that mattered, and that appearances were always secondary to the hard reality of power. Ormund Hightower understood something that many lords never learn. A war is not won by the largest army or the most dragons. It is won by making certain that every sword, every sack of grain, every ship in the harbour, and every lord in the war council is pulling in the same direction at the same time. And that is precisely what he set out to build in the months following the victory at the Honeywine. The pieces were already scattered across the southern reach, waiting to be gathered. Prince Daeron Targaryen, the youngest son of King Viserys, had proven himself at the Honeywine not merely as a dragon rider, but as a commander who could hold a line. His dragon Tessarion, the Blue Queen, had turned the tide of battle with fire and terror, but Daeron himself had shown a steadiness that Ormund recognised and valued. The prince was young, but he was not reckless. He listened, he learned, and he did not let the power of riding a dragon convince him that he was invincible. That made him useful. That made him dangerous to the enemy. But Daeron was only one piece. The Reach Lords, who had rallied the Green Banner, were another matter entirely. Lord Rowan, Lord Tarley, Lord Costane, and a dozen others had brought their levies, their knights, and their supplies. Each of them had his own ambitions, his own grudges, and his own private calculations about how the war might end. Some were loyal to Aegon II out of genuine conviction. Others had thrown in with the Greens because they saw the Hightowers as the surest bet. A few, Ormund suspected, were waiting to see which way the wind blew before committing fully. He did not begrudge them their caution. He simply made certain that their options narrowed the longer they stayed in his camp. Then there was the wealth of Oldtown. The Hightowers had always been the richest house in the Reach, and Ormund had access to that treasury. He paid his soldiers on time. He bought grain when the harvests were uncertain. He commissioned armour, weapons and siege equipment from the smiths of the city. He funded the construction of supply depots along the roads his army would march. Money, in a war like this one, was as powerful as any dragon. It bought loyalty. It bought time. It bought the ability to wait while your enemy starved or scattered. And finally, there was royal legitimacy. Aegon II sat the Iron Throne in King's Landing, crowned in the Dragon Pit with the support of the High Septon. That mattered. It mattered in the courts of the Reach, where lords who had sworn oaths to the Iron Throne needed a reason to break them. It mattered in the eyes of the small folk, who were more likely to support a king who had been anointed by the gods than one who had simply claimed the crown by right of birth. Ormund made sure that every lord who joined his host understood this. They were not rebels. They were loyalists. They were the true defenders of the realm. Gathering these pieces was the easy part. The hard part was turning them into a single coordinated machine of war. Ormund did not simply assemble an army. He built a system. He established a chain of command that ran from his own tent down to the lowest camp follower. He appointed quartermasters to oversee the distribution of supplies, scouts to map the roads and rivers ahead, and engineers to maintain the bridges and fords that his army would need to cross. He held councils every evening, not to debate strategy, but to confirm that every order had been carried out and every problem had been addressed. He did not tolerate excuses. He did not tolerate delays, and he did not tolerate lords who thought their titles exempted them from discipline. The result was an army that moved with a precision rare in Westerosi warfare. When Ormund gave an order, it was executed. When he set a march, the columns formed at dawn and reached their destination by nightfall. When he called for a council, the lords arrived on time and prepared. It was not glamorous work. It was not the stuff of songs, but it was the kind of work that won wars. And the contrast with the chaos spreading across the rest of Westeros could not have been starker. In the Riverlands, the war had dissolved into a brutal, shapeless conflict of raids and counter-raids. Lord Lannister's army had been shattered at the Burning Mill. The Blackwoods and the Brackens were slaughtering each other in a feud that predated the Targaryens. Prince Aemond was flying Vhagar across the countryside, burning castles and villages with a fury that seemed less like strategy and more like rage. In the Crownlands, the Blacks were regrouping, their forces scattered but not destroyed. Rhaenyra was still on Dragonstone, still holding the loyalty of the Velaryon fleet and the Dragon Riders who had not yet committed to battle. The war was far from decided. But in the south, Ormund Hightower was building something different. He was building an army that could march, fight, and win without relying on the unpredictable terror of Dragonfire. He was building a coalition that would hold together even when the fighting turned against them. He was building a machine, and at the center of that machine was Ormund himself. He was not the most charismatic commander in Westeros. He did not inspire the kind of fervent loyalty that made men charge into certain death for the sake of his name, but he did not need to be loved. He needed to be effective, and effectiveness, in his experience, came from preparation, not passion. He knew the names of his captains. He knew the strengths and weaknesses of each house that had answered his call. He knew the roads, the rivers, the fords, and the fortresses that lay between Oldtown and King's Landing. He knew how many days of food his army carried, how many arrows his archers had, and how many horses his cavalry could field. He knew, because he had made it his business to know, and he had made it his business to ensure that every lord under his command knew as well. This was the Green War Machine. It was not a single battle or a single dragon. It was the sum of 1,000 small decisions, each one made with the same cold calculation. It was the wealth of Oldtown, the loyalty of the Reach, the legitimacy of the crown, and the discipline of a commander who refused to leave anything to chance. And as the army prepared to march north toward the lands that would decide the fate of the realm, Ormund Hightower sat in his tent, studying a map of the roads that led to Tumbleton. He did not know exactly what awaited him there, but he knew that he would be ready. He had made certain of that. The Green War Machine was now a thing of motion, and motion has a direction. For Ormund Hightower, for Prince Daeron, for the thousands of men who had marched from Oldtown, and the smaller hosts that had joined along the way, that direction was northeast. The Honeywine had been a victory, but a victory that clarified the map rather than ending the war. The Reach was not yet won, and the next name on that map, the next place where roads converged and armies would have to meet, was Tumbleton. You might hear the name Tumbleton and think of a minor town, a footnote in the great ledger of Westerosi geography. But in war, a town is never just a town. Tumbleton sat at a crossroads. It was not a castle, not a fortress in the traditional sense, but it commanded the routes that connected the northern reach to the King's Road, the Rose Road, and the river routes that fed into the Blackwater. To hold Tumbleton was to hold the ability to move men, supplies, and messages between the heart of the Reach and the Crownlands. To lose it, or to let it fall into enemy hands, was to have that ability severed, and so the Hightower advance was not simply a march toward a battle. It was a march toward a prize of roads, of supply depots, of strategic access that would determine whether the Green Army in the south could link up with the forces fighting for King's Landing, or whether it would remain isolated, forced to fight a war of attrition across the fields and villages of the Reach. But here is the truth that every commander learns, and that Ormund Hightower understood perhaps better than most. An advancing army does not bring stability to the lands it claims to protect. It brings hunger, it brings fear, it brings the grinding weight of thousands of men who need food, who need fodder for their horses, who need shelter, who need wood for their campfires, and leather for their boots, and iron for their swords. Every mile the Hightower host covered, the countryside felt the strain. Farmers watched their grain stores dwindle. Village elders watched their young men conscripted or driven away, and the lords who had not yet chosen a side watched the approach of an army and felt the pressure to decide, to declare, to commit before the choice was taken from them. Ormund was not blind to this. He had planned for it. His reputation for secrecy and contingency was not simply about political manoeuvring in the courts of Oldtown. It was about the practical reality of moving a force of 15,000 men through a landscape that was not yet fully pacified. He had sent riders ahead, not just as scouts but as negotiators. He had arranged for supplies to be gathered at waypoints, for bridges to be secured, for local lords to be reminded of their oaths to the Iron Throne and the cost of breaking them. Every step was calculated. Every halt was a calculation of risk and reward. But calculation has its limits, and the road toward Tumbleton was not a straight line drawn on a map. It was a winding, uncertain path through a region where loyalties were shifting like sand. The victory at the Honeywine had broken the back of the initial black resistance in the Reach, but it had not destroyed it. Survivors had fled north and east, carrying word of the Green Army's strength and its methods. They told stories of dragonfire, of Tessarian's blue flame cutting through the night, of the Hightower standard rising over the battlefield. And those stories did not always inspire surrender. Sometimes they inspired fear, and fear in a land at war can be just as dangerous as defiance. The closer the Hightower host came to Tumbleton, the more the signs of that fear became visible. Abandoned farmsteads, villages where the only inhabitants were the old and the infirm, the young having been sent away or hidden, roads that had been deliberately broken or blocked, not by enemy soldiers but by local people who wanted to slow the army's advance, to buy themselves a little more time before the war arrived at their doorsteps. Ormund's men had to clear those roads, repair those bridges, find new routes when the old ones were made impassable, and every delay cost them something: food, morale, the element of surprise. And yet the advance continued, because Ormund Hightower was not the kind of commander who turned back. He had committed to this campaign. He had staked his reputation, his house's wealth, and the lives of his men on the belief that the Green cause could be won in the south, that the Reach could be secured, that Tumbleton could be taken and held. He had Daeron and Tessarian at his side, a dragon that could burn a path through any obstacle. He had the loyalty of lords like Lord Costain and Lord Bulwer, men who had fought beside him at the Honeywine and who trusted his judgment. He had the weight of Oldtown behind him, the gold and the grain and the swords that made his army the largest standing force in the realm. But the road toward Tumbleton was teaching him something that no amount of planning could have fully prepared him for. Victory is not a single event, it is a process, and every step forward creates new vulnerabilities, new complications, new enemies. The town itself was not yet in sight, but the war was already changing. The Reach was no longer a chessboard, where pieces could be moved with precision. It was becoming a battlefield, where every decision had consequences that rippled outward, touching lives that had never asked to be touched. Ormund Hightower was approaching a place where victory might prove costly, not because Tumbleton was a fortress, but because it was a symbol a symbol of the green advance, of the Hightower will, of the war's expansion into the heart of the continent. And symbols in war are never taken without a price. The road toward Tumbleton was long, and it was growing darker with every mile, but Ormund kept marching, because that is what a commander does. He marches, he plans, he hopes that the cost, when it comes, will be one he can bear. The road toward Tumbleton had been laid with promises, but the army that marched along it was held together by something far more fragile than oaths. Ormund Hightower understood this in a way that few of his fellow commanders did. A lord could issue commands from the saddle, could speak of honour and duty and the rightful king, but the men who carried those commands into reality were not abstractions. They were flesh and blood, driven by appetites and grievances, and the quiet hope that war might make them richer than peace ever could. The host that gathered under the Hightower banner was not a single thing. It was a coalition of competing interests, each with its own reason for being there. At its core stood the hard men, the veterans who had fought in a dozen smaller conflicts across the Reach. These were soldiers who had learned their trade in skirmishes along the Dornish marches, in the suppression of bandit lords, in the endless low-grade violence that simmered beneath the surface of peacetime. They did not fight for Aegon II or for the memory of Viserys I. They fought because they knew how, and because the pay was reliable, and because a man with a sword and a full belly had fewer questions than a man with neither. Around these hardened core gathered the opportunists. Every campaign draws them, the way a carcass draws crows. Merchants who had fallen on hard times, younger sons with no inheritance, men who had gambled away their lands and now saw war as the only way to win them back. They came to Ormund's camp with letters of introduction and tales of past glory, and they watched the Lord of Oldtown with hungry eyes, waiting for him to make a mistake that they could exploit. Ormund saw them for what they were, but he did not turn them away. A host needed numbers, and numbers did not care about motive. Then there were the knights. The Reach is famous for its chivalry, and the Green Cause had drawn many of the region's most celebrated warriors. Men like Sir Brynden Hightower, a cousin of Ormund's own house, who had won renown in tourneys from Lannisport to King's Landing. Sir Alan Beesbury, whose family had once been loyal to the Blacks, but who had chosen the Greens after careful calculation. And Sir Rickard Thorne, a knight of the Kingsguard, sent south to represent the Crown's authority in Ormund's camp. These were men who believed in the cause, or at least in the version of it that had been presented to them. They spoke of honour and duty, and they meant it. But honour, Ormund knew, was a fragile thing when tested against the reality of a campaign. The ambitious allies were the most dangerous of all. Lords who had brought their own levies, their own supplies, their own agendas. Lord Unwin Peake, whose family held lands in the Northern Reach and who saw the war as an opportunity to expand his influence. Lord Owen Fossaway, who commanded a contingent of archers and who had made it clear that his loyalty was conditional on the promise of plunder. And perhaps most troubling of all, Lord John Roxton, a man whose reputation for violence was matched only by his appetite for wealth. These were not men who could be commanded in the traditional sense. They had to be managed, coaxed, and occasionally threatened. Ormund had learned to speak to each of them in the language they understood. To Lord Peake he spoke of lands and titles. To Lord Fossaway he spoke of gold. To Lord Roxton he spoke of the enemies they would face and the spoils that would follow their defeat. But managing these men was only half the challenge. The other half was managing the gap between Ormund's grand strategy and the appetites of the soldiers who had to execute it. A lord sees the war as a map, a series of movements and counter-movements, a game of position and timing. A soldier sees the war as a village that might be looted, a farmhouse that might be burned, a defeated enemy whose possessions might become his own. Ormund understood this divide intimately. He had grown up in Oldtown, surrounded by scholars and maesters, and he had learned to think in terms of years and decades. But the men beneath his banner thought in terms of days and nights, of the next meal and the next opportunity. This tension was nowhere more visible than in the question of plunder. Ormund had given strict orders against the looting of villages along the line of march. He understood that a hostile countryside would starve his army faster than any enemy could, but the men did not see it that way. They saw the wealth of the Reach passing by them, untouched, and they resented it. The hard men muttered that they had not marched all this way to watch farmers keep their grain. The opportunists whispered that Ormund was hoarding the spoils for himself. The knights tried to maintain discipline, but even they could feel the hunger growing in the ranks. It was Lord Roxton who brought the issue to a head. He came to Ormund's tent one evening, his armour still stained with the dust of the road, and he spoke plainly. The men were restless, he said. They had been promised victory, but victory without reward was an empty thing. Ormund listened, his face unreadable, and then he gave an answer that revealed more about his command style than any battle plan could. He told Roxton that the army would reach Tumbleton within a week. Tumbleton was a prosperous town, a centre of trade and supply. When they took it, the men would have their reward, but until then, discipline would hold. Anyone who broke the peace would face the Lord's justice, and that justice would be swift. Roxton accepted the answer, but Ormund knew that acceptance was conditional. The men would wait, but only as long as the promise of plunder remained alive. If Tumbleton proved difficult, if the siege dragged on, if the town's defences held longer than expected, that patience would evaporate. And when it did, the hard men, the opportunists, the knights, and the ambitious allies would each make their own calculations. Some would stay, some would leave, some would turn on each other. This was the reality of command that Ormund had to navigate every day. He was not leading a single army. He was leading a collection of armies, each with its own commander, its own culture, its own grievances. The green cause gave them a common banner, but it did not give them a common soul that had to be forged day by day through a combination of promises, threats, and the careful distribution of rewards. Ormund had learnt this art from his uncle Otto, who had spent decades in King's Landing managing the egos of lords and princes. But Otto had operated in a world of words and letters, of favours and debts. Ormund operated in a world of steel and fire, where a single mistake could cost thousands of lives. The fragility of discipline became clear on the third night before the army reached Tumbleton. A group of soldiers from Lord Fossaway's contingent broke into a storehouse outside a village called Longtable. They took grain, ale, and a small amount of silver. The village headman protested, and one of the soldiers struck him with the flat of a blade. The headman's son ran to Ormund's camp and demanded justice. Ormund had the soldiers arrested, tried them before a hastily assembled court, and ordered the ringleader hanged. The execution was carried out at dawn, in full view of the entire host. The men watched in silence, and for a moment, Ormund saw something like fear in their eyes. But he also saw resentment. The hanging had restored order, but it had also reminded every man in the army that their lord valued discipline over their desires. That night, Ormund sat alone in his tent, the Valyrian steel blade Vigilance resting across his knees. He thought about the men he commanded, their strengths and their weaknesses, their loyalty and their greed. He thought about the lords who watched him, waiting for a sign of weakness. He thought about Darren and Tessarion, the dragon that gave the green cause its fire, but that also made every battle a gamble. And he thought about Tumbleton, the town that would either be the making of his campaign or its undoing. The men beneath his banner were not perfect. They were flawed, hungry, ambitious, and dangerous. But they were his to command, and he would use them as the situation demanded. The road ahead was uncertain, but Ormund Hightower had spent his life preparing for uncertainty. He had studied history, collected maps, and learned the art of patience. Now he would put that knowledge to the test. The army marched on, and Tumbleton waited, and the hard men, the opportunists, the knights, and the ambitious allies all watched their lord, wondering what he would do when the moment of decision finally arrived. The previous chapter left us among the men beneath Ormund Hightower's banner, a gathering of hard knights, ambitious lords, and conditional loyalties. That army was a coalition built on necessity, not trust. And as the green host pressed deeper into the Reach, the strain of holding it together became the central challenge of Ormund's command. Now that strain would find its breaking point, because the road was leading to Tumbleton. And Tumbleton was not merely a town, it was a crossroads of supplies, a prize of roads, and a place where allegiances could shift like the wind over the Mander. The campaign had brought the green forces into the tense orbit of Tumbleton, a settlement that sat at the junction of several major routes through the Reach. Whoever controlled Tumbleton controlled the movement of armies between the southern coast, the Honeywine, and the approaches to King's Landing. For Ormund, it was a strategic necessity. For his allies, it was something else entirely. Some saw it as a chance for plunder. Others saw it as a place to make deals, to test the winds, to decide which side truly had the advantage. And for a few, Tumbleton was the stage on which they would betray everything. What made Tumbleton dangerous was not its walls or its garrison. It was the fact that the town had already changed hands once during the war. And the memory of that first occupation lingered. The small folk remembered which lords had marched through their streets, which banners had flown from their gates. They remembered who had taken what and who had promised what in return. And the lords themselves remembered who had been willing to bend the knee when the other side arrived. That history of shifting allegiances hung over the green camp like a fog, because every man in Ormund's host knew that Tumbleton could be the place where loyalties were tested again. Military success, as Ormund was learning, had a way of exposing fractures inside the victorious coalition. When the army was marching and winning, the differences between its members could be papered over with shared purpose. But when the army stopped, when it settled into a town and began to plan its next move, those differences rose to the surface. The Reach lords who had joined the Green cause did not all share the same goals. Some wanted land, some wanted revenge, some wanted to be on the winning side when the war ended. And they were watching Ormund closely to see if he could deliver that victory. If he stumbled, they would not hesitate to look elsewhere, and there was the deeper danger, the one that Ormund had been planning for since the beginning of the campaign. He was relying on allies who might serve themselves before any king. The men beneath his banner had sworn oaths to Aegon II, but oaths were only as strong as the fear of breaking them. In the Reach, where loyalties had been traded like grain since the start of the war, a lord who saw a better path for himself would take it, regardless of what he had promised. Ormund knew this. He had built his strategy around it, but knowing a danger and controlling it were two different things. And Tumbleton was the place where that gap would become visible. The town itself was not large, but it was wealthy enough to attract attention. Its markets held goods from the surrounding countryside. Its inns could quarter officers, and its granaries could feed an army for weeks. For the Green host, Tumbleton was a chance to resupply, to rest, and to consolidate before the next phase of the war. But for the men who had been marching for months, it was also a chance to indulge. Discipline, which had held the army together on the road, began to fray once the soldiers settled into the town. There were disputes over quarters, over supplies, over women. There were arguments between lords who had been feuding for generations, now forced to camp within sight of each other. And there were whispers, always whispers, about what would happen next. Ormund watched it all from the tower where he had made his headquarters. He was a man who preferred to see the whole board before making a move, and Tumbleton was giving him a view of the fractures that had been hidden during the march. He saw the way certain lords kept their own council, the way they met in private after the war councils had ended. He saw the way some knights lingered near the town's gates, as if measuring the distance to the road. He saw the way Daeron Targaryen, his ward, and the commander of Tessarion looked at the horizon with something that was not quite patience. The young prince was eager for battle, eager to prove himself, and Tumbleton was not a battle, it was a waiting game. And waiting for an army like this one was the most dangerous thing of all, because while Ormund planned, while he calculated the movements of his own forces and the positions of the enemy, other forces were moving in the shadows. The Blacks had not forgotten the Reach. They had their own agents in the towns and villages, their own lords, who were willing to switch sides for the right price. And in Tumbleton, those agents found fertile ground. The town's merchants, who had suffered under the first occupation, were not eager to see the Greens take everything they had. The local gentry, who had sworn to Aegon II, but remembered the days of Rhaenyra's rule, were weighing their options. And the common soldiers, who had no stake in the succession, but every stake in their own survival, were listening to anyone who promised them a better chance. Ormund's careful plans were entering the most unpredictable stage of the war. He had built his campaign on deception, on contingency, on the ability to appear compliant while preserving alternate paths to power. But Tumbleton was not a place where compliance worked. It was a place where decisions had to be made, where alliances had to be tested, where the price of strategy was paid in trust. And trust, in the reach of the dance, was a currency that had been devalued long before the first dragon took flight. The men beneath his banner were watching him. The lords who had joined his host were waiting for a sign, a signal, a decision that would tell them whether Ormund Hightower was the man who would lead them to victory or the man who would lead them to ruin. And in the shadows of Tumbleton, the agents of the Blacks were already at work, offering the one thing that could break any coalition: a better offer. Ormund knew that the next move would define everything. He could hold the army together through force of will, through the authority of Oldtown, through the presence of Tessarion in the sky. But force and authority and dragons were not enough to bind men who had already begun to look for their own exits. The fractures were there, visible to anyone who cared to see them. And the question that hung over Tumbleton, the question that would determine the fate of the Green campaign in the Reach, was whether Ormund could close those fractures before they became a chasm. The answer would come not from his planning, but from the actions of the men around him. And in Tumbleton, those actions were already beginning to unfold in ways that no strategy could fully predict. The town was a crucible, and the Green Coalition was being tested in its fire. What emerged on the other side would depend on which loyalties held, which broke, and which were simply waiting for the right moment to change. The victory at Tumbleton was a triumph, but even as the green banners flew over the town, the cracks in that victory were already beginning to show. And those cracks, more than any single battle, reveal the true nature of the war the Greens were fighting. Because the Dance of the Dragons was never just a contest between dragon riders. It was a war between institutions, between the old powers of Westeros and the new, between the families who had built the realm and the family who had come to rule it. And no family embodied that older, deeper power more completely than the Hightowers of Oldtown. To understand Ormund Hightower is to understand that he was not merely a general. He was the living embodiment of Oldtown itself. And Oldtown was not just a city. It was the intellectual, religious, and economic heart of the Seven Kingdoms. The citadel, where maesters were trained, sat at its centre. The Starry Sept, the former seat of the faith, stood as a monument to centuries of devotion. And the Hightower, that ancient beacon of black stone and pale fire, had watched over it all for thousands of years. When Ormund marched to war, he brought all of that with him. Not just swords and spears, but legitimacy, history, and the kind of wealth that could buy a kingdom. The famous dragon riders of the dance, figures like Aemond One-Eye or Daemon Targaryen, dominate the songs and the stories. They are the ones who ride the beasts, who burn cities, who die in spectacular fireballs above the god's eye. But the war could not have been fought without the men who supplied the gold, the grain, and the thousands of marching feet. Ormund Hightower was one of those men, but he was also far more. He was the architect of the green war machine in the Reach, the man who turned the wealth of Oldtown into a weapon that could match the dragons themselves. Consider what Oldtown brought to the green cause. The Hightowers were among the wealthiest houses in all of Westeros. Their control of the port at Oldtown gave them access to trade routes that stretched from the Summer Isles to the shores of Braavos. The tariffs alone from a single year of merchant traffic could fund a campaign, and that wealth was not just in gold. It was in grain, in timber, in the iron that came from the Reach's mines. When Ormund assembled his host, he could feed it, arm it, and pay it long after other lords would have run out of resources. The 15,000 men he led were not just soldiers. They were a testament to the logistical power of a city that had outlasted empires. And then there was the matter of lineage. The Hightowers were not dragon lords, but they were something almost as valuable in the politics of Westeros. They were ancient. They had held the same seat, ruled same city, for longer than the Targaryens had been in Westeros. When Ormund spoke, he spoke with the authority of a house that had seen the rise and fall of kings. That kind of prestige could not be manufactured. It could not be seized by conquest. It was earned through centuries of survival, through marriages and alliances, and the quiet accumulation of power. And in a war where legitimacy was everything, having the Hightowers on your side was a statement that could not be ignored. But Ormund's impact went beyond the battlefield. He reshaped the very nature of the Green Cause in the Reach. Before his campaign, the war in the south had been a series of scattered loyalties and uncertain allegiances. Houses like the Beastbris and the Costains had wavered, unsure which side would prevail. Ormund changed that. He brought the full weight of Oldtown to bear, not just as a military force, but as a political one. He offered protection to those who swore for Aegon and made clear the consequences for those who did not. And he did it all with the cold patience of a man who had been planning for this moment for years. Because Ormund was not a man who acted on impulse. He was a scholar, a collector of histories and tapestries, a man who believed that knowledge was the truest form of power. He had spent years studying the wars of the past, learning from the mistakes of other lords. He knew that a war won in a single battle could be lost in the aftermath, and so he planned for the aftermath as carefully as he planned for the fighting. He built alliances with houses like the Tarlis, the Rowans and the Redwynes, curing their loyalty not just through fear, but through shared interest. He made sure that the Reach would remain green, even after the dragons had finished their work. And yet, for all his careful planning, Ormund was not a man without temper. Those who crossed him learned quickly that his patience had limits. He could present one face to the world while pursuing a completely different agenda in private. He could appear compliant, even submissive, while maneuvering his pieces into position for a devastating countermove. It was a style of leadership that made him dangerous in ways that a more straightforward commander could never be. The war in the Reach was not just a series of battles. It was a struggle for the soul of the region, and Ormund Hightower was determined that soul would belong to the Greens. He understood that the dance was not just a fight for a throne. It was a fight for the institutions that supported that throne. The faith, the citadel, the great houses of the south, all of them had to be brought into line if Aegon's reign was to be secure. And Ormund, more than any other Green commander, had the connections and the credibility to make that happen. His wardship of Prince Daeron Targaryen was a perfect example of this strategy in action. By taking the young prince into his household, Ormund bound House Hightower even more tightly to the royal family. Daeron was not just a ward. He was a symbol of the alliance between Oldtown and the Iron Throne. And when Daeron rode to war on the back of Tessarion, the Blue Queen, he did so as a Hightower as much as a Targaryen. The dragon and the city became one. But even as the Green host marched from victory to victory, the fractures were already forming. The coalition Ormund had built was strong, but it was also fragile. The lords who followed him did so for their own reasons. Some wanted land, some wanted revenge, some wanted to be on the winning side. And as the war dragged on, those competing interests began to pull at the seams of the alliance. Ormund could hold them together, but only as long as he could deliver victories. And victories, in a war of dragons and shifting loyalties, were never guaranteed. The Hightower shadow over the dance was long, and it touched every corner of the conflict, from the gold that paid for the armies to the maesters who advised the kings. Oldtown's influence was everywhere. Ormund Hightower was not the most famous figure of the war. He was not a dragon rider. He did not die in a blaze of glory, but he was, in many ways, the most important, because he understood that the dance was not just a war of fire and blood. It was a war of patience, of planning, of the slow grinding accumulation of power. And in that kind of war, the man who could think 3 moves ahead was worth more than any dragon. The previous chapter traced the long shadow that Oldtown cast over the dance of the dragons, the weight of its gold, its lineage, and its ancient prestige. But a shadow is not a hand. It does not march, it does not command, and it does not wield a blade. To understand how that shadow became a weapon, you have to look at the man who stood at its centre, the lord who watched the war unfold from the south, not as a spectator, but as its architect. Ormund Hightower did not need to be the loudest voice in the room. He did not need to sit the Iron Throne or ride a dragon. He understood something that many of the great lords of Westeros forgot in times of chaos. That true power is not about who strikes first, but who is still standing when the dust settles. His legacy is not written in a single battle, but in a lifetime of patience, preparation, ruthlessness, and an unyielding commitment to dynastic survival. Think about the nature of Oldtown itself. It is the oldest city in Westeros, the seat of the Citadel, the home of the faith. It is a place of knowledge, of record-keeping, of long memory. Ormund was the product of that environment. He was not a brute who stumbled into command. He was a lord who collected histories, who studied tapestries, who understood that the present is always built on the foundations of the past. When he looked at the war, he did not see a clash of dragons and armies. He saw a game of succession, a crisis of legitimacy, and an opportunity for his house to cement its influence for generations. This is why he was so dangerous. While other lords rushed to declare for one side or the other, driven by passion or ancient grudges, Ormund calculated. He knew that the Greens needed more than just a crown. They needed a kingdom that could function, a treasury that could pay for armies, a bureaucracy that could supply them. Oldtown provided all of that, and Ormund made sure that the price of that support was influence. His weapon, Vigilance, is the perfect emblem of this mindset. It is a Valyrian steel blade, ancient and rare, but its name tells you everything. Vigilance is not a sword of glory. It is not a sword of conquest. It is a sword of watchfulness, of readiness, of the lord who always looks beyond the immediate move. When Ormund held that blade, he was not thinking about the next swing. He was thinking about the next decade. He was thinking about his sons, his daughter, his grandchildren. He was thinking about the High name and what it would mean long after the dragons were dead. His family was the engine of his strategy. His 3 sons, Lionel, Martin, and Garmund, and his daughter Bethany, were not just heirs and a bargaining chip. They were extensions of his will. He had taken Daeron Targaryen as a ward after the boy's father died, binding the Hightowers even closer to the royal line. Every marriage, every wardship, every alliance was a thread in a web that he had been weaving for decades. The war did not create Ormund Hightower's power. It merely gave him the stage to use it, and he used it ruthlessly. When he marched with the Hightower host, he commanded perhaps 15,000 men, the largest standing force left in the realm. But he did not waste them on theatrics. He did not seek personal glory in the field. He used them to secure the strategic heart of the Reach, to control the roads, to hold the towns that supplied the war effort. His campaigns around Honeywine and Tumbleton were not about heroic charges. They were about logistics, about pressure, about forcing his enemies to react to him. There is a particular quality to Ormund's style that is worth understanding. He could appear compliant when necessary. He could submit publicly, bend the knee, offer terms, and make it all seem genuine, but that submission was always a feint. It was a way to buy time, to preserve his forces, to wait for the moment when the counter move would be devastating. He was a man who could smile while planning your ruin, and you would never see it coming until the trap closed. This is the central truth of Ormund Hightower. While others chased glory, while dragon riders fought for the history books, while kings and queens screamed their claims from thrones of swords, Ormund Hightower built the power that could decide a kingdom. He did not need to be remembered as a hero. He needed to be remembered as the Lord who won. And so we return to that image. Ormund, standing beneath the Hightower, the great beacon of Oldtown, watching the war from the south. He is not in the thick of the fighting. He is not on a dragon. He is not in the throne room. He is at home, in the seat of his power, surrounded by the records and the maps and the histories that tell him exactly how this game is played. He is patient. He is prepared. He is ruthless. And he is thinking about the next move, the one that will ensure that the Hightower name endures, no matter who sits the Iron Throne when the war is finally over.